Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps good evening, depending on where your place is in the world. My name is John Germain. I'm the Executive Director of the New York City Pediatric Disaster Coalition, and I would like to welcome you to the first annual Dr. Michael Frogel Memorial Pediatric Disaster Preparedness Conference. I'll just quickly go over today's agenda, and then we'll get to some business here. Um, Dr. George Fulton, I'm going to turn over the torch in just a moment, and he'll provide some welcome remarks. And then I'll proceed to provide a program introduction and also be speaking about Dr. Michael Frogel and memorializing him. George will also be joining me with some of the introduction material. This will take approximately a half an hour, and then we'll transition over to Dr. Mark Cicero from Yale, who will be giving an overview on pediatric disaster preparedness initiatives going on locally in the United States as well as on the state and federal level. Then the following hour after that will be Dr. Chip Schreiber from UCLA, who will be talking about pediatric disaster mental health issues. Following the next hour will be Dr. Jennifer Anders from Johns Hopkins, who'll be talking about pediatric surge and bed crisis. And then finally, in the last hour, will be Dr. Matthew Harris of Cohen Children's Medical Center of Northwell Health, talking about pediatric mass casualty incident planning and guidelines. With that said, we'll begin with some introduction material, but first I'd like for George Fulton to just give some welcoming remarks.
Hello, everybody. On behalf of the New York City Pediatric Disaster Coalition, I welcome you to our seminar this year. The part of the mission of the Pediatric Disaster Coalition is to provide guidance, education, input, and partnership within New York City for the purposes of ensuring that the children's needs are served. As part of this mission, we also provide education on the broader tri-state area and anywhere else that we work with. And so this seminar is part of that. This has a particularly the word I want to use is touching moment for me, somber moment, but also a celebration. Dr. Michael Frogel was my partner in crime for 16 years from the time that we established the New York City Pediatric Disaster Coalition after working with the New York City Department of Health to establish that such an entity was needed. New York City, as you know, is large, has lots of resources, but just like every other process that I've been involved with, which included pre-hospital care for children, trauma centers for children, et cetera, the needs of children were often overlooked, not intentionally, but just because the people who are running the system are mostly oriented on adults, and the vast majority of the need is on the adult side, which means that children make up only a small percentage of the needs of society, but they make up 100% of the needs of our children and families. What I learned from working with Mike was what an amazing advocate he was, never backed down, always wanted to do the right things for children, and was a particularly wonderful partner. And I got to know him really well, obviously, over those 16 years. And I always thought of him as having endless energy. And it was quite sad and tragic that he became suddenly ill and passed away. But he has left behind so much in terms of the people that he's worked with, the lives that he's touched, and the children that he has helped both here and in other countries, especially in Israel. For me, this is a poignant point, and I just wanted to say that. And I look forward to the wonderful speakers and experts we have here today sharing important information and continuing Mike's work. I will say that in many ways, this year is a special year because we have become part of the Pediatric Pandemic Network, which is, I believe now will be known as the Pediatric Preparedness Network, representing Region 2, which is New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And this was work that was very important to Mike all along, was this national work. And I think that he would have been very pleased that we finally became part of the bigger effort. And perhaps he was helping guiding that from above. So I'm going to turn this over now to John. And thank you, everybody here, for attending. And I hope we get chances to talk to each other and interact.
Thank you very much, George, for those words. We'll now begin the program, and George, we'll work on this together. Feel free to interject at any time to give your take. But let's talk a little bit about children for a few minutes. Why do we need pediatric specific plans? Children are simply different. They're not just small adults. They have special needs and require special care, different types of medication, different types of treatment, and different types of responses. We have an estimated 78 million children within the United States, which is approximately 25% of our population. And quite simply, children are our largest vulnerable population. We have children that are disabled, that have more complex needs, and we have children that are tech dependent on various equipment. Approximately 11% living at or near the poverty line. And of course, their response and environment are determined by adults. This is a child during Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast. So there's an event in Asia. The good thing here is the child seems to remain fairly calm, and there's PPE, which is a good thing. And what can disasters be? You know, we all have our hazard vulnerability analysis, our HVAs, and we know that hazards fall into, various categories, primarily three of them: human caused, technological, and natural. And children can fall into any of these categories, whether it's a public health outbreak, whether it's a terrorist attack, or whether there's a train derailment that causes an automobile accident on a school bus, for example, or God forbid, a nuclear incident. Children with special and complex healthcare needs can also be victims of an MCI, which is a mass casualty incident. And you can imagine responding to an incident of this nature, being a first responder, or the patients coming into the emergency department, how challenging this can be and scary for some. Just a couple visual aids here from the different events around the country that have taken place directly impacting children. Two very significant events. One, of course, in 1995, the Federal Murrah Building in Oklahoma City, vehicle-borne explosive device. Unfortunately, there was a nursery, childcare within the building, resulted in the death of children. More recently, of course, September 11, 2001, the World Trade Center saw a great increase in post-traumatic stress and very, very bad mental health reactions to that event,
So,
particularly.
John,
Go
I'd
ahead,
like
George,
to just interject here.
please.
Something that probably Chip will touch on, but the picture all the way to the right of the fireman holding the deceased baby was a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph at Oklahoma City. And the thing about that photograph is that it's very poignant, but it also points out a very important issue, which is that fireman was holding a dead child, and really what he should have been doing was put that child down and go back and rescue somebody who's alive, perhaps somebody, an adult or a child. And what it shows us is the huge psychological impact that injured or very sick children have on our first responders, and that it can not only have implications on handling mass casualty events in the moment, it can go on to carry lifetime issues for those providers. And many times they will look back on their careers, and the things that affect them most might have been that very uncommon but interaction with either a sick or injured child, and they may feel a lot of guilt about it, even though they may have done everything they could. So what it brings up is the importance of our immunizing our providers to make them understand that they will have a heavy psychological response to children, and help them to cope with it before, during, and after. Over time, we've come to recognize this more and more. Thanks. You can go on and continue.
Thank you, George. And to mirror what Dr. Fulton just said, similar with the children, in this case with 9/11, there was long-term effects on the pediatric population from that event, from everything that went on, what they witnessed, as well as losing family members and neighbors and loved ones and friends. Photograph here of the Murrah building, just absolute destruction. Now moving on to a more relevant, from a local standpoint, incident. What could have happened if the bomb had gone off in Times Square? So this was May 1st, 2010. It's hard to believe it was at this point over 15 years ago. It was a Saturday night in Manhattan. Many of you likely have been to Times Square. Some of you perhaps haven't, but maybe are familiar with it on television. You can imagine what the sidewalks look like and what the buildings contain in terms of the populations of people. This is a map just basically displaying a couple significant points. One of them being a Toys R Us store, another being a Disney store, and another being the Minskoff Theater, which was hosting a Broadway show for children, The Lion King. It seats approximately 1,600, and it's estimated that about 2/3 of the occupants at the time were children. And here's the visual presentation of exactly what this looks like at any given time in Times Square during the day and at night up until the late night hours. As I mentioned, the Minskoff Theater, Toys R Us, Disney. The good news is this explosive failed to detonate. Therefore, there was no injuries, there was no damages, there was no fatalities. However, had that occurred, I think it would have looked something very similar to the Murrah building in Midtown Manhattan, and the casualty level of children would be just off the charts. There was a study conducted in New York City by the Pediatric Disaster Coalition following the incident, and it was estimated based on a survey of pediatric intensive care unit beds that there was only between 18% and 22% capacity available to treat critically injured children in PICUs across the city at that time. So had this occurred, it would have been an absolute catastrophe, which leads us to further fuel our mission into what we do. The Pediatric Disaster Coalition had already been around for 2 years at this point, but it really enabled us to look further into secondary transport, as well as primary transport, low leveling, surge capacity planning. And George, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that that these events help us in terms of our thinking and how we affected the decisions of the New York City disaster response. One of them is one of our prime theories is if there's a major, especially traumatic event, that we would rather overload the major pediatric facilities with the major injuries rather than try to level load those to places that cannot give interventions that are necessary for those children. And I'll give you 2 examples of that. One would be that if you have a large number of head traumas that need neurosurgical intervention, you would want to send them to the major pediatric facilities that have pediatric neurosurgeons, even if it means that we go into some kind of disaster process where we move them in and out of the OR quickly. It's preferable to sending them to an institution where they're reluctant to actually do the procedure because they don't have the necessary skills. And that brings up the idea that we would need to make sure that the flow of patients to those major centers is really the most ill and injured, and try to have the less ill and injured or those who can wait longer for treatment to go to secondary centers. And that is part of the plan that we put together to have a coordination between a group of pediatric intensivists and New York City DOH, that in time of a crisis, they would ask that group, which we call the PERT, to triage those patients online so that EMS would know where to take them, because they wouldn't have the capacity to do that kind of sorting. And that is much, much preferable to having them land at the secondary institute and need another transport. And an important example of that, again, a thought experiment, was that the time that the plane landed on the Hudson River, everybody knows very well about that, and everybody was on the wings, including parents with babies in their arms. So imagine that 2 of the babies had fallen into the Hudson River. and were hypothermic, and one was taken to a nearby hospital that has a pediatric facility but cannot do cardiac bypass, and the other was taken to a major center on the Upper West Side that does cardiac bypass. They both had the same injuries, but the one who went primarily to the major center and got on bypass quickly had no neurologic deficits. The one who had to go to the other hospital and then needed to be transferred did. So that makes, again, the case that where you go first may make a difference in outcome. And that was another theory that helped us with New York City emergency management to understand that they needed some pediatric expertise at the time of sorting in a mass casualty, which fortunately we have not really had yet, but it's part of our thinking. John?
Thank you very much. And that leads us into the New York City Pediatric Disaster Coalition and who we are. The New York City Pediatric Disaster Coalition has been operating since 2008, established to prepare New York City for a mass casualty incident involving the pediatric population. We have an all hazards approach to the New York City healthcare system across the board, not just hospitals, but also community health. We're funded by the New York City Department of Health. The funding comes federally from the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, ASPR. Our membership includes, of course, the New York City Department of Health, the New York City Fire Department, New York City Emergency Management, every pediatric hospital within the city, as well as other stakeholders from federally qualified health centers, urgent care centers, the Community Healthcare Association of New York State, and others. An interesting picture here. This is exactly what this looked like in 2008. You can imagine how many of these institutions have changed hands in terms of management and ownership and mergers and acquisitions. So a lot of different branding, but this is exactly what it looked like back in start in 2008. And we currently have 28 hospitals that treat pediatric patients as part of our membership. This is just a broad overview of, again, who we are and what we do. We've created a 24/7, 365 pediatric intensivist response team. On call, there's an intensivist that operates and practices in New York City on call 24 hours a day. We have a bi-weekly schedule with a backup. We have approximately 18 team members that rotate throughout the year. And the team is formed to be on call in case there is a mass casualty incident and the need of secondary transports to help triage, sort, prioritize those patients, to provide subject matter expertise, and to act as a consult for the New York City Fire Department, as well as the New York City healthcare system. We've been very involved with search and evacuation planning. We've done everything from workshops to tabletops to citywide full-scale exercises at multiple institutions at once. Surging patients with treating it as if it's very real with role players as well as mannequins. We've had major tabletops that have gone on for multiple hours, as well as on the evacuation side, actually evacuating neonatal units with a fire scenario and various boroughs throughout the city at different institutions. We've had a whole host of various deliverables since 2008 that have varied from surge planning toolkits and templates and guidelines to those of evacuation, to working with FQHCs on the outpatient side, to working with EMS to train them in triage protocols for children. The list quite goes on. This is pretty much what I've highlighted right here. Notably, we've also been involved with real-time disasters, of course, Sandy, Ebola, H1N1. There was a highly fatal fire on January 9th, 2022, which is our first official activation of the PERT team when PERT stepped in and we helped coordinate and communicate transfer of patients from one facility to another that had fire and burn exposure, but primarily smoke inhalation. And that was a very successful event for us to stand up and learn from. So we're very proud of that. George mentioned at the beginning why we're here today, and that's for, of course, the kids, as well as very much for Dr. Mike Frogel, who we lost. Mike spearheaded this with George since 2008. They were co-founders and partners together. I came into the picture in 2016 and worked under their wing from an administrative standpoint. Um, but Mike was, as George will tell you, the absolute nucleus of this operation. This was Mike's life, his pride, his love, and he was incredibly passionate and dedicated. I realize not all of you knew Mike. I'd imagine a number of you on this program, knew Mike personally or professionally, perhaps in some way, shape, or form for some period of time. But over the next few minutes from the time we have remaining on our end, I'd like to speak about Mike, and I've prepared some remarks. So I would appreciate your time and attention over the next couple of minutes. I'll go ahead and read these. For 8 years, I had the honor of working with Dr. Michael Frogel at the New York City Pediatric Disaster Coalition. In fact, it was Mike who hired me when I arrived at the coalition back in 2016. Over the years, I got to know Mike quite well, and I would like to tell you more about Mike's storied career and share the remarkable person he was. Michael Paul Frogel was born into a religious Jewish family on September 27, 1950. He grew up in Brooklyn in the Bensonhurst neighborhood along Bay Parkway. Mike attended Yeshiva University and upon graduating began medical school at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. True to his continued roots in New York, Mike would find himself completing his residency at Long Island Jewish Medical Center, where he made chief resident his third year. LIJ would become a place Mike would call home over the next 4 decades. First at Queens Hospital Center, which was then part of LIJ, and later at Schneider Children's Hospital, known today as Cohen's Children's Medical Center of Northwell Health. It was at Cohen's Mike would make his way up the pediatric department ladder, earning too many titles, appointments, committee roles, and awards to keep track of. These are things Mike rarely mentioned, but instead things I discovered over the years from his CV. He was a distinguished leader, a mentor to so many, but most notably was his dedication for providing and improving pediatric healthcare. Mike was a true pioneer pediatric champion and disaster preparedness advocate from the beginning. And this all carried over beyond his long accomplished clinical career into his 2008 establishment of the New York City Pediatric Disaster Coalition with Dr. George Fulton. As time went on, Mike emerged as a nationally recognized and highly respected expert in the world of pediatric disasters. He established the National Pediatric Disaster Coalition with Patricia Frost in 2015 and became a key advisor to RAPM, the Western Regional Alliance for Pediatric Emergency Management, as per Pediatric Center of Excellence in 2019. When it comes to pediatric disaster preparedness, Mike's achievements and impacts locally and nationally over these last 20 years could never possibly be expressed in this speech. And that's not even touching on his work in Israel. These are stories for another time, but if there's one thing so many of us remember the most, that was Mike's passion. There was no individual who was a more passionate pediatric advocate than Mike Frogel. Mike was not only a highly passionate professional, but a man who was just as dedicated to his family as he was the pediatric community. He was a loving husband to his wife and father to 4 sons, all of whom have become just as successful in their careers as Mike was in his. Later on came Mike's next generation of pride, his grandchildren, and in more recent time, a great-grandchild. Mike truly loved spending time with his family, especially during holidays and going on trips to Israel, which eventually became his second home and his final resting place. Mike resided in the Bell Harbor section of the Rockaways until the very last years of his life. He was a devoted member of his synagogue and community, including opening his door to local concerned parents seeking care for their sick child. Mike was full of energy, both in his work contributions and in his personal life. He would routinely swim in the ocean during the summers and would play full court basketball even until his later years. Mike didn't live a cookie cutter life. For those of you who know him well enough, you know what I mean. The Mike I knew was the world's greatest boss, the one could ever have, the best one could ever have. But he was much more than just my boss. As my time with PDC went on, Mike became a great friend despite being much older than me and coming from different backgrounds. To me, Mike was like family. Mike had a unique way about him to connect with people, especially when they were in a time of need. He was there for me when my own father passed away, and Mike would help anyone because that's who he was. I greatly admired Mike's strong ethics and his willingness to always do the right thing, no matter how difficult it was, no matter who or what he was up against. He was humble and would gladly give the credit to someone else if it would benefit the children of the world. Like his career, I could never possibly put into words how special of a person Mike was or the impact he had on me over these last 8 years. Some of us knew the fight Mike Frogel had in him. He would never back down from any battle, and 2024 brought the greatest one yet for him. Mike remained tough, but we would ultimately lose Mike last April to a rapid severe illness. We all have dreams in life, including Mike, and it's because of people like you who are so dedicated to the mission of improving pediatric healthcare that Mike's dream will always be fulfilled. Mike is the prime example of a person who did what they loved in life, excelled at it, and left their mark on the world. There is no replacing Mike Frogel, but we could all do our best to try to be like Mike. If there is anything you could take away from today, please remember Dr. Michael Frogel is a man of faith, a family man, a person of great integrity, and an invaluable asset to the pediatric community. May he rest in peace and never be forgotten. I would like to thank you all for taking the time to honor Mike today and for carrying on his legacy. And I ask you to join me in a moment of silence for Mike. Thank you. And at this time, to move the program forward, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Cicero. Dr. Cicero provides care for patients in the emergency department at Yale New Haven Children's Hospital. He is an associate professor of pediatrics and emergency medicine, and also an emergency medicine professor at Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Cicero focuses his research on how children are treated during disasters. Small and large-scale disasters over the last 20 years have included disease outbreaks, terrorist attacks, and gun violence. These events show that we need to do a better job caring for kids in disasters, according to Dr. Cicero. His contributions have included the publication of original research about disaster medicine and education and response strategies. And with that said, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Cicero when he's ready, and it's an honor to have him here with us today.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, George. Thank you all. I'm honored to be part of this memorial for Dr. Frogel, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share with you some opportunities and a call to action regarding pediatric disaster readiness at the state level, at the federal level, and within our neighborhoods and at the local level. I'm going to pause and just ask for a thumbs up to just assure me that the slides are visible.
You look perfect.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that. So the title of our talk is National Pediatric Disaster Readiness, Federal Partners Collaborating in Axles, Hubs, and Spokes. But as we know, and as we say so often when we talk about disasters happen locally, they affect people locally. The response from state resources may take hours or days to come aboard, and federal resources, organized federal resources, may take many days or more, depending on the sort of disaster we're talking about, the kinds of resources that are required, and also depending on the accessibility of the location. So this is really a way for us to pause and examine all of the efforts or select efforts in the pediatric sphere to promote disaster readiness, and also to take a look at how those pieces come together when a disaster happens. When we think about the disaster cycle, when we think about preparedness, when we think about response, recovery, and mitigation, I must admit that this talk focuses largely on preparedness and also on response. And later on in the afternoon, we'll be thinking about the whole of the cycle. I'd like to stop too and acknowledge that that I've been the beneficiary of lots of federal support that's allowed us to do the work that we'll be discussing. And I appreciate the support and mentorship of Dr. Fulton, of Pat Frost, of Art Cooper, and of course of Dr. Frogel, to think about the National Pediatric Disaster Coalition in the New York City Pediatric Disaster Coalition. On the federal level, I've had the opportunity to serve as a medical officer for HRSA and the EMSC Pediatric Pandemic Network. I've served the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, both on the National Biodefense Science Board and the National Advisory Committee on Children in Disasters. I've been the principal investigator for 2 EMSC targeted issues grants. Currently, I'm the PI for a Toyota Way Forward Fund initiative involving the pre-hospital setting, which is one of my first loves, and the care of children who've had concussions. And I also currently work with the Pediatric Pandemic Network education domain. I share all these not to go through my CV, but to say that I've had the opportunity to learn a whole lot about disasters, and I continue to learn. And I really look forward to opportunities to share what I've learned and to learn alongside all of you as colleagues and friends. And also realizing that the network to achieve readiness for children in disasters is still incomplete. And what we're going to be talking about today and what our goals will be today really focus on first defining the state of federal pediatric disaster preparedness work, regardless of where the sway of power is federally or what initiatives are going on within a set administration. This is work that has been defined by decades. And it's important to think about the overarching work that unites both agencies within Health and Human Services, but also work by the White House and work done by the military, and how all of this comes together in promoting readiness. We're going to take a look at the federal pediatric disaster preparedness work. And we'll look specifically at agencies like ASPR, HRSA, both the Pediatric Pandemic Network and its overarching and complementary EMSC. And we'll take a look at complementary efforts for pediatric preparedness and response, like I said before, at the state level and also within municipalities and neighborhoods. So those are our goals as we work our way through the talk. And thinking about all of this, if our response to disasters is local and the resources are coming from initially local, and I also have to acknowledge the important role of non-governmental organizations such as the Red Cross, even within the United States in disaster response. And we understand that initially the resources we have on hand are those that we've prepared for, that we've prepared within our communities, within our hospitals, within our EMS agencies. So many of us have been doing this for a while, but for the benefit of those new to this space, I'd like to call out what this word salad looks like, all these different acronyms. And I wanted to write these out. And I'd like to call out that under Health and Human Services, so many of the agencies that are responsible for day-to-day preparedness for children and also disaster preparedness are under the auspices of Health and Human Services. And like to call out the special connection between emergency medical services for children and the Pediatric Pandemic Network, which administratively on the federal side is a special project of EMSC. EMSC has a history that's more than 40 years long and stems from the recognition that as we say quite often, that children have special needs when it comes to their emergency care, and that both in the pre-hospital setting and in community hospitals, there's a gap between where the care is and where it could and should be. And the Pediatric Pandemic Network is now approaching 5 years old and has an issue that holds an issue as far as the preparedness portion of the disaster cycle. We look at national organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, other professional organizations, the Emergency Nursing Association, the National Pediatric Disaster Coalition, and so many others represented by the 228 of us joining today, and so many of us active in this space. I'll encourage folks just to take a look and be sure they're muted. And there are, at the state level, everything from the offices of EMS, departments of health, and health coalitions, and increasingly statewide and multi-state health systems that are players in the disaster preparedness space or have the opportunity to be and need to be encouraged to be active in these spaces. I'll pause when we get to the local level and say, on a day-to-day basis, healthcare in the United States, I would argue, is fragmented, that the ability to find the right subspecialist within one's community may mean going across multiple health systems, navigating MyChart or other digital doorways that can make it difficult to coordinate a person's care, even if they have the wherewithal, the absence of language barriers, and have the ability to navigate all of the communications needs in order to be active in seeking care. In a disaster, the communication framework at the local network can be compromised quickly. In a disaster, the day-to-day competition among large healthcare systems needs to be replaced by cooperation and an understanding of where the available pediatric beds are, where the subspecialty beds are, and where the beds are in general, and which hospitals have all of their resources available and which are compromised. So EMS agencies, health networks, hospitals, physician and provider offices, thinking about the work of Dr. Scott Needle, who's been a voice for pediatric practices and independent providers, especially in disaster readiness and response. All of these pieces, if they are coordinated ahead of time and have a common vision for how children need to be cared for, are more likely to be able to deliver that care than if they're meeting when the disaster occurs. So these are the players, and an emphasis on the idea that the initial response will really be at the local level before all the state and federal agencies can begin their work. Now that we've had a bit of an orientation to the various agencies that are particularly active in pediatric disaster readiness, here's a map that zooms us out to the whole of the United States, the territories, and the freely associated states. And you can see that, that we have 10 preparedness regions across our country. And all of these federal agencies, as well as others, recognize these 10 response areas. And you can see that the various states and territories and affiliated states, that the territories largely are associated with Region 2, which includes New York, and then, of course, the association between Puerto Rico and New York is strong, as well as New Jersey. And that the state of Hawaii and the territories in the Pacific are associated with Region 9, and that Alaska is a critical part of Region 10. So this gives us a framework to think about how the federal government thinks about preparedness and thinks about resources across the space. In thinking more about ASPR, we'll take a bit of a dive on the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. And when we think about everyday readiness, a key theme for this talk is everyday pediatric readiness. And ASPR serves a really important role in coalition building, in the support of state and regional coalitions, and training and education and drills. Some on the call may know Mark Libby. For many years, he was the ASPR Regional Emergency Coordinator and served us here in Connecticut. And people in the role of RECs promote regional preparedness and are the boots on the ground that are liaisons between the federal space and what's happening at the state level and the sub-state level. Also, ASPR provides technical assistance, response framework support, and until quite recently, provided a number of national advisory committees. Most relevant to our talk today is the National Advisory Committee on Children in Disasters, and we'll talk a bit about them later. So this is an example of how the federal government interacts with state and local response. And there's really a bidirectional piece here. Again, folks in the role of REC, including Mark Libby, traditionally have served to create situational awareness between what may be the impression that's going on and what's actually going on in the field. And also,
yeah. Okay,
there's the feel.
Yeah, that's really helpful,
There's a
actually.
feel.
And do you know,
That's my colleague, Mark Auerbach from Yale. Hello, Mark. In responding to evolving incidents and events and providing command and control for HHS resources and assets. So it's really important that these bridges are maintained after they're built and that they help promote readiness on a day-to-day basis. Moving forward in the role of ASPR, we think about the technical assistance piece and large-scale exercises, which is going to tie right into the Pediatric Centers for Excellence that we'll describe in just a little bit. So we just examined what everyday disaster readiness looks like. Next, we're going to take a look at what ASPR does during a disaster. Really, ASPR has a strength in that it is responsible for the Strategic National Stockpile, or SNS. These are caches of disaster response materials that are available across the country in specific areas that can be deployed in the event of a disaster. And it can also represent not just the stuff, but the skill and the people that are necessary for response and that are tied to the assets that can be deployed in the center of this diagram. ASPR provides air traffic control. It helps with decisions as far as whether a disaster should be declared. Those decisions are made by state level executives, but can provide resources for making these declarations. And also provides updates for the Secretary's Operations Center. Now that ASPR is a administration rather than an assistant secretary, the SOC may have a different name, but the idea still is that it is a federal bird's eye view that takes a look at response to disasters specifically. And then also can tap into the subject matter experts that may populate the national advisory committees, including the National Biodefense Science Board and the National Advisory Committee on Geriatrics and Disasters, as well as the NACCD. So to take a look at some preparedness efforts very specific to our topic today, and thinking about creating a network across the country, a network of networks and a blanket for the country that helps for preparedness. This is a theme that I want to talk about as we go through this. We're going to talk about the PPN. We're going to talk about the Centers of Excellence. We're going to talk about the PPN's new affiliate hubs. And then we'll take a look at what that looks like overlaid with the country several times. So the Centers for Excellence we'll examine first. There are 3 of them, and one of them, that's Region 5 for kids, overlays with one specific region, the Great Lakes, and Region 5. RAPM, the Western Response Alliance for Pediatric Emergency Management, overlaps 2 Western preparedness regions. And Dr. Schreiber, who'll be speaking later on in the afternoon, is a member of RAPM. And finally, there's the newest of the centers, which is Gulf 7, which subsumes a number of states across regions 4 and 6. as well as Puerto Rico. And this is really important as a model for communication within regions and regions that may be affected by similar disasters and can share resources. Moving forward to think about the hospital preparedness program. ASPR's hospital preparedness program is a relatively large scale initiative that provides funding to all 50 states as well as America's largest cities, and promotes readiness for disasters, including the pediatric piece. For many years, HPP grantees must have a letter of support from an EMSC state partnership in order to both demonstrate partnering with statewide readiness efforts, and also as a check to be sure that pediatrics and pediatric issues are accounted for in those preparedness efforts. And that's an important step. And as we think about weaving this blanket of readiness across the country, perhaps we can think about ways to even more closely align EMSC, the Pediatric Pandemic Network, and the HPP. Additional pieces include the National Advisory Committees and the Committee on Children and Disasters. Earlier this year, I still am seeking clarity regarding the role of the NACCD, which, again, I disclosed that at one point I did serve on the NACCD, and the NACCD in its most recent form has helped with some significant resources regarding mental health of children before, during, and after disasters, and as well as providing technical assistance and support and advising the Assistant Secretary and the administration. And recently, these efforts have been put on a kind of hold. I won't say more about it because, as I say, I'm seeking clarity about it. So we'll back up and discuss the Centers for Excellence, which have the goals that you see here, looking at coordinated pediatric care across regions and serving as a means for helping to counterbalance the day-to-day competition and opacity of the healthcare system, being sure that EMS has the opportunity to be heard by healthcare systems, that public health officials are at the table with providers and provider organizations, and strengthening pediatric disaster plans across systems and across municipalities and beyond. And looking at, again, regional and interregional pediatric medical surge capacity. We see from the previous map that there are those 3 active centers of excellence, and we see how 2 of them give examples of how to cross over preparedness regions, and one shows a really well integrated singular region. And I wonder often whether there's an ultimate goal of having similar centers of excellence that blanket the country, and how sharing best practices among these 3 active centers for excellence can help to continue to raise the bar, to maintain healthcare professional competency and having some standardized learning. There's complementary effort going on at the Pediatric Pandemic Network, and an important distinction here is the work between these initiatives from ASPR and from HRSA are not duplicative, but rather complementary. Finally, in thinking about the work of the Centers of Excellence, really having situational awareness capabilities and being sure that we know what's available, what the training is, and how we all work together so that as we prepare, we get ready to respond. A bit more about the HPP. The HPP has a broader focus now than it did traditionally. It's not just hospitals. It also looks at EMS and emergency management. It looks at public health, and it looks at building coalitions. Earlier, I'd mentioned some of our largest cities, and those are mentioned in the infographic here. And also, there's an impressive number of healthcare coalitions that are represented. in making the work of the hospital preparedness program, and having a shared response framework, and having significant stakeholders within pediatrics. And in looking at the materials themselves, it's been said that HPP is certainly pediatric aware and pediatric inclusive. There may be opportunities to either tie the HPP to resources from pediatric specific entities like the Pediatric Pandemic Network or EMSC, to, rather than reinvent the wheel, share those resources and help with dissemination. All right. About the National Advisory Committee on Children in Disasters. Within this composite photo are some of the greatest people I've ever had the chance to work with. There are thought leaders in pediatric behavioral health and mental health, particularly around disasters. There are skilled surgical leaders. There are pediatric emergency physicians. There are folks who are adept at how we interact and how organizations work, and so many other skill sets within this group. So they're comprehensive disciplines, and it's comprehensive, and the representation here is a set of people who represent the groups that we want to see included in the hospital, in the hospital preparedness or HPP work. And by bringing this group to the table, there's the opportunity to actively create advisory documents, to respond to ongoing events. And this is a group of people who are looking to roll up their sleeves and have made a commitment as special federal employees. And their resources and their ability to contribute to national and local disaster readiness is significant. So I'll end by saying that I fervently hope that the National Advisory Committee on Children in Disasters will have the opportunity to do its work going forward. All right. So far, we've introduced a lot of the resources and the activity of ASPR. Here's the map again with regional preparedness. We've talked about those 3 centers of excellence. And now we're going to take things in a different direction and take a look at the Pediatric Pandemic Network. The PPN was launched, as its name implies, during the pandemic in recognition of the social, behavioral, mental, physical consequences of the ongoing pandemic, and not necessarily just the effect of a virus directly on children, but the effect of a virus on communities, on families, on mental health, on schools, and on everything that's normal about life for children. The initial 10 hubs are represented here. And you can see that they are pretty evenly distributed across the regions, the disaster preparedness regions that have been recognized in the federal space. We have, for example, UCSF Benioff representing Region 10 and Region 9 represented by Seattle Children's. 2 regions initially were not represented with the initial hubs. And as we look to weave the blanket of pediatric readiness across the country, and after we had the 3 ASPR Centers of Excellence, recognizing that the Pediatric Pandemic Network is a HRSA initiative to promote not just pandemic readiness, but disaster readiness for children across the country. There was the recognition that bringing on affiliate hubs in these 4 locations, Oklahoma in Oklahoma City, the Oklahoma City Children's Hospital, Dell Children's in Austin, Texas, thus increasing the representation within that region with 2 strong children's hospitals represented there. and then bringing a board to represent Region 1, New England, where I'm sitting now with my children's hospital and Yale New Haven Children's Hospital, and right across Long Island Sound, the most recently announced affiliate hub at Cohen Children's Medical Center and Northwell Health. So each one of these hubs, in addition to being a leader in disaster readiness and a regional children's hospital, brings what leaders in the PPN like to say as its superpower. It's unique or its scarce resource that it helps to bolster the whole of PPN. For example, thinking about how Oklahoma Children's Hospital brought to the PPN better understanding of the needs of Native, Indigenous children, and also has a strong commitment to rural health for children, for one example. And the whole of PPN is certainly stronger than its parts because of the opportunity to draw from all of these superpowers, all of these experiences. I'll call out Children's Mercy Kansas City and say that earlier in the talk, we were talking about situational awareness in disaster response for children. In other words, where are the beds for children? Where are the beds overall? And what does capacity look like? Children's Mercy offers a phenomenal means for tracking the availability of beds in its patient progression hub. Are there solutions represented at Children's Mercy that could be adopted by other children's hospitals around the country as they look to solve problems rather than needing to start from the ground up? So the PPN helps with blanketing the country and now represents all 10 of our preparedness regions, and also serves as a city and neighborhood level model, because every one of these children's hospitals has a parental advisory committee, and many of them have a teen advisory committee, and all of them are active in their communities and integrated into community health centers and so forth. So they have resources and approaches that can be shared among the other children's hospitals of the country. In fact, there's a goal of ultimately all 188 acute care children's hospitals in the country having an affiliation with the PPN. That can start with having a champion of the PPN and having a contact of the PPN within the children's hospital, and then expand from there as far as bidirectional sharing of resources, questions, information, both in readiness and response, but also recovery and in mitigation. Thinking more about the Pediatric Pandemic Network, thinking about its vision, the network aims, as you see here, to empower the healthcare systems and communities to provide high quality, equitable care to children every day and in crises. So a much broader approach than the name might imply. This is about being ready every day. And the North Star is ultimately to decrease pediatric morbidity and mortality during disasters and increasing national readiness for children in disasters. We need to aim high as far as what our goals are in bringing every resource together and working together and collaborating to do complementary work. And to reach the goal of decreasing pediatric morbidity and mortality, measuring that when we think about the analytics domain of the Pediatric Pandemic Network, and when we think about the research domain, to reach those goals, we need to achieve more bedrock and foundational goals like having better communication and preparedness at the state and local level. And next, thinking about the Pediatric Pandemic Network, the idea is that children's hospitals serve as regional hubs to improve the care for children in pandemics and in disasters and every day. In that regard, it's complementary to the work done by Emergency Medical Services for Children, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the idea is that the hospitals work regionally and nationally, that they work with the sorts of institutions and organizations you see on the screen, and that there is a pre-designated group of SMEs that can share that information during disaster response, and also career development so that we can bring along the next generation of professionals in this space. So, just like we looked at for ASPR, let's take a look at what HRSA and PPN do in everyday pediatric disaster readiness. I think some of the strengths of PPN include the education and preparedness piece. It's workforce education and preparedness. It's building networks and partnerships that is really key to this. It's creating coalitions around each of the hubs of PPN. It's providing resources for quality improvement and metrics so that health systems can assess both their baseline pediatric disaster readiness through assessments like the ongoing PDPAC, and then doing repeat assessments to decide if initiatives have helped to achieve the goals. It's research. And research not just for research sakes, but research to identify and close gaps in pediatric readiness, and its resources. For those who are less familiar with the Pediatric Pandemic Network, I'd encourage you to check out the Pediatric Pandemic Network's Resource Central, where there's a growing stockpile of, I think it's fair to say, thousands of resources that have been pre-vetted, and there's an opportunity to use that resource to help augment disaster readiness within your organization. Okay, so that's everyday readiness. Now we'll just take a look at the role of PPN during a disaster. As far as the response, each one of these hubs is a functioning children's hospital, and there's the clinical and operations piece, but also coordination with EMS agencies, public health, and the like, and dissemination of research-informed care. We do the research in the preparedness phase so that we're ready when it's time to respond, so that we can take that pre-existing knowledge and put it into action on the first day of the disaster and throughout the recovery phase. We also work in situational awareness, and within PPN, there's the importance of connecting pediatricians, but not just pediatricians, everyone who cares for children, to real-time linkages for support systems, and by which we mean, what are the best practices and how do we best respond to this ongoing disaster? All right. I've got a bit of an example I'd like to share. And here we are in one of my favorite parts of the country, which is the Pacific Northwest. There, you'll remember that Seattle Children's Hospital serves as the regional hub. And there we are with our central focus there as far as Northwestern United States. It's interesting. The population centers are out on the coast, and there's a lot of high desert between Seattle and Spokane. There are long transport distances for children who live in rural central Washington state, similar for Oregon. And in order to think about what this means from a coalition standpoint, we need to think all the way up into the northwest of this Region 10, all the way up to Alaska with its Children's Hospital in Anchorage. And we need to think about all the way over into Idaho, which is part of the preparedness region, and St. Luke's and Boise, Randall Children's Hospital in Oregon, and taking a look over in Spokane with its Children's Hospital at Sacred Heart, Dornbacher at OHSU, and then Marybridge, which is in Tacoma. Why put all these up here? I put these up here because even if you don't live in the Pacific Northwest, and heck, most of us don't who are on this call, what we're looking at on the screen right now is a model for how the PPN works in hubs and spokes for readiness. And you can imagine, do this again, you bring these together and think about preparedness. You weave together the preparedness through research, through coordination, through communication, through tabletop drills and exercises, and through ongoing communication that doesn't just happen once with annual or every 2-year kind of drills, but is an ongoing action of preparedness. So here's what it looks like within Region 10. We see bidirectional communication among the spokes of the of the children's hospitals all within the region back to the hub. There's communication with Seattle Children's, but this isn't even a complete picture. There's communication among all the children's hospitals, perhaps with one another, and also communication among each of these children's hospitals with the community hospitals that refer patients to them. We're talking about an area that is really large compared to my relatively small region in Region 1. So transport distances are large, and it's important to have a good existing telehealth infrastructure and an understanding of how best to tap into the resources from children's hospitals, particularly when there's the reality that children's hospital, or the pediatric care, I should say, is becoming more and more concentrated, such that, say, a community hospital in Eugene, Oregon, for example, may have had a number of pediatric beds in 1990 that it does not have in 2025. So there's the hub and spoke model, and here's what the anatomy of a mature pediatric pandemic network might look like in Region 10. We might zoom out of the country, take a look at Seattle, the hub for the region, and then all of the children's hospitals that are active within the region. And we have the bidirectional communication, the communication such that a single children's hospital, in this case, Dornbacher Children's at OHSU, is communicating bidirectionally with EMS, with community hospitals, with community-based providers, with vaccine and other community infrastructure, and also with municipalities and with payors, with insurance companies, in doing both collaborative work, but also doing advocacy work so that we are ready. So, and even what you see up on the screen with all of its arrows and images and icons is a simplification of what a complete Region 10 or any region looks like within PPN. So this is a vision for what PPN is and can be in every region, and then crossing over regions. All right. So next, we're going to pivot to the next of the agencies I want to highlight in our talk, which is EMSC and its role in everyday pediatric readiness. Different than the Pediatric Pandemic Network in that it looks to foster readiness on a day-to-day basis in community hospitals, in physician offices, and with EMS, of course, is implied in the name. So it's raising the boats for readiness, or raising the tide, or raising the floor, if you will. It's building capability and capacity. Capacity being where do we put the kids, and capability being the supplies, the knowledge, and the ability to care for them. Assessing the readiness. An assessment is an ongoing and continual process, as those who've worked in the National Pediatric Readiness Project and the Pre-Hospital Pediatric Readiness Project will attest. Nearly as soon as one assessment is done, it's really time to begin the cycle for the next. But not just assessment for assessment's sake, it's assessment to see whether active initiatives have measurably improved readiness and are associated with better outcomes for children. It's integrating pediatrics in hospitals and pre-hospital agencies. It's disseminating research, and the Pediatric Emergency Care Applied Research Network is an integral and important engine for research that's under the auspices of EMSC. And it's the pre-hospital and hospital networks. And also, this is another example where we can take a step back from this federal slide and think about what happens on the state and local level here within the state of Connecticut, and probably within the states and territories represented by the participants here. EMSC state and territory partnerships work to build that network and be sure that there's good communication and integration between, say, for example, pediatric emergency care coordinators in the hospital setting and in the EMS setting, so that policies and protocols at the state and at the local level are integrated so that the care begins in the pre-hospital setting, and then it aligns well with what's going to happen once the child comes to the emergency department. So those are the everyday readiness efforts. And next, there's the role of EMSC during a disaster. EMSC is really the boots on the ground at the top of the circle here as far as providing pediatric care. If we've done a good job as a state partnership and as a federal EMSC in providing resources and training, then the care that'll be provided will be stronger when the disaster comes as well and when the yellow binder comes off the shelf. There's the utilization of networks, and it's the time to call upon the coalitions and to share resources. It's turning to the pediatric emergency care coordinators, the physicians and providers and nurse techs, and understanding the flow of patients and where beds are available. It's comprehensive hospital data to state advisory committees, and it is local emergency care is needed to support recovery when we pivot from the response phase to the recovery phase, because ultimately it's all cyclical and we go back to the day-to-day provision of care, and also the recognition of those who are still suffering the consequences of disasters when things are looking more back to a new normal. All right, so this is the first slide where we've put together work from ASPR, EMSC, and PPN, and it's really a summary. These are the strengths of these federal agencies, and and certainly there's some complementary overlap, but also some strong differentiation. ASPR has an emphasis on drills and exercises. It has strength in its regional emergency coordinators, or RECs, the strategic national stockpiles, and the response framework. EMSC, as we just examined, conducts research, assesses readiness. It raises the tide as far as readiness, and it integrates pediatrics in hospitals and pre-hospital agencies. And maybe it also helps to suggest that maybe we should stem the tide of the concentration of pediatric care so that children don't need to leave their community if they need to be hospitalized. And then the PPN, with all of its work for building the workforce, for establishing partnerships and resources, doing research specifically aimed at pediatric preparedness for disasters, quality improvement, and the sorts of hub coalitions we saw in the figures that we saw a little while ago. All right, that was everyday readiness. Here it is summarized again as far as all the roles in disaster. And ASPR is often leading the charge as far as response, as far as coordination of federal resources. However, we know that EMSC is a really important conduit between federal resources and state and local response, and that PPN during a disaster, especially as PPN matures, and especially with the addition of the newest affiliate hubs, we can coordinate and call upon the coalitions that we've built and put them into action. And all of these organizations, just like the bidirectional arrows we saw in Region 10 in the Northwest, there is the opportunity to share and build the preparedness and the response during the disaster. All right, so let's take a look at where we are as far as building that blanket. We have the three centers of excellence represented in the red outlines that have been colored in there: Region 5, G7, and RAPM. We have the latest edition of the affiliate hubs, calling them out because they're relatively new and possibly less familiar to participants, as well as the red arrows that represent the established hubs of PPN. So that's where the state of preparedness looks like right now, with both the combined ASPR and PPN assets. So the location of U.S. children's hospitals and the establishment of new children's hospitals, is not likely to be something that has a strong initiative where there are new children's hospitals coming online over the next decade. We know that some areas of our country are experiencing a population increase, and that largely, in some northern regions, that the population is relatively stagnant. And I say this to acknowledge that there may not be the will to establish children's hospitals where they don't exist. So if someone lives in the light green area of the map that we're taking a look at here, which are people who live more than 100 miles from a children's hospital, what are the ways that we can promote readiness for emergencies and disasters that affect children there? We've been building an axle, hub, and spoke model where the federal agencies and then state and local partners serve as axles around which the hubs, be they the PPN hubs or the centers of excellence, and then the spokes, the groups with which they work and learn from and with, work together. But if someone lives in North Dakota, where the nearest children's hospital is, hundreds of miles away, or if someone lives in, for example, American Samoa, and we're aiming to improve readiness there, or, is this the right model for truly all hazards and disasters? Earlier, when we were reflecting on the life of Dr. Frogel and thinking about disaster readiness, I was thinking about this idea of an all hazards and all patient approach that we, especially in past decades when I was coming along as a trainee, this idea of an all hazards approach was pretty much in vogue as far as disaster readiness. When in reality, a disaster, by definition, overwhelms available resources. And that could be a minivan with unrestrained children that roll over in, say, northern Montana, where if the same thing happened in New York City, it'd be a bad EMS call, but the resources exist to take care of it. So is that readiness prepared? Is that readiness prepared in all regions with this model, or are there needs for further closing of the gaps? And I see that there's a number of very interesting questions that are popping up. I'll be wrapping up with some minutes left, and maybe we can take some of those questions, including the definition of children's hospitals. So thinking about ways to do some complementary efforts to ensure care is available to pediatric patients remote to children's hospitals. One of the focuses of PPN is telehealth and the ability to augment the care provided in community hospitals. We talk a lot about cognitive unloading when we talk about either simulations or we talk about dosing of medications for children in the pre-hospital setting, for example. I think about telehealth as a way to do cognitive unloading for skilled nurses and physicians who work in community general emergency departments who are dealing with uncommon or rare pediatric emergencies. Telehealth is one way that we can promote improvements in care for children in community settings far from children's hospitals. Other ways include a preparedness approach, including education and being sure that the right resources and right equipment are readily available and that people have an opportunity to train with them so that when one sick kid comes in, they're ready. Thinking about proximity to children's hospitals too, we can see that there are wide swaths of the country where the pediatric population lives far from a children's hospital. And in looking at all of these efforts in coalition building, the hospital preparedness program, which aims to, or it partners with EMSC to improve readiness for children, and having the national response framework, there may be opportunities to further augment the pediatric piece here. this whole day is devoted to pediatrics, but these best practices are also relevant to those who have mobility differences, who use languages other than English, to folks on the other end of the age spectrum, to geriatric patients. The same sorts of vulnerabilities exist. So work from ASPR can help close these gaps and make it so that that community hospitals in rural locations and far from central hubs have opportunities to deliver the highest quality of care. And I'm not saying they don't do that already, but I am saying there may be gaps, and where there are gaps, we need to close them. Again, PPN provides best practices, quality improvement, and helps build the resources and workforce. And when we think about HRSA and EMSC for people who live far from children's hospitals, it's communication and protocols for transport. It's the further you are from a children's hospital, and I would argue the more important it is to have a PAC. It's important to have a PAC no matter where your EMS agency or your hospital is, but certainly distance makes a PAC more precious. And doing the research to help understand which of these interventions are associated with better outcomes for children who live in remote locations. All right. If you'll allow me, this example is now nearly 2 years old. However, I include the Maui wildfires of August 2023 in closing this talk because this was an example of how the federal agencies worked with state and local responders to help bring their assets and their ability to respond to bear during a terrible natural disaster. By building collaborations and having opportunities to build coalitions before the wildfires in Maui, the PPN was able to provide mental health first aid resources, and Dr. Schreiber, I imagine, will be sharing these kinds of resources during his talk. Also providing community and youth trauma resources and providing caregiver mental health resources with an understanding, as John Germain had said to us during his talk, that there are the survivors of the disasters, and then that those of us who work in healthcare are certainly affected by delivering that care during a disaster, and we need to be sure to tend to our own physical and mental health needs. ASPR worked in helping to declare the disaster and was crucial with its National Advisory Committee on Children in Disasters and providing resources and also boots on the ground responders. And EMSC had been working via state partnership to improve readiness for years ahead of time. And finally, dissemination of resources to Maui Ambulance. So with that example in mind, we can think about the future. If you'll indulge me again, here's the future of the Cicero family. And thinking about all of we've talked about here today, we see that the resources from PPN, from ASPR, from EMSC, this is really a model rather than an end state. There's a need to build further partnerships with the resources that you see here, in whatever state they may be, and also to think about all the places where children receive care, where they spend their time, and being sure that schools are prepared for disasters, that the food stream within the United States is guarded from infectious diseases and potential disasters that can come from drought and potential famine. And as the son of a former farmer, I often like to quote, they were all 3 meals away from a disaster at any given time. And thinking about other ways to bring in state, local, and federal assets. ASPR and HRSA particularly have differentiated complementary roles, and many of us, myself included, have benefited from the support of these organizations, and that's allowed us to learn more and share more about pediatric disaster preparedness and response. So there's my contact information. It's been an honor to share this talk with you and to be part of this important memorial for Dr. Frogel. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cicero, for that excellent presentation. I know there's a couple questions in the chat. Do you want to address some of those now, or would you like to just type them in on your own time?
Whichever fits best for the arc of the day's agenda. I'm happy to take a couple questions now. We could also take a bio break, and I can go through the chat. I'll leave it to your discretion.
We probably have about 2 or 3 minutes. So if you want to just tap into a few of those, feel free, and then we'll transition to Dr. Schreiber.
I'll go for it. I want to say thank you to Paul Stengel and to Pat Frost for sharing resources. I want to thank Gretchen Brummel. I'm just scrolling through here, but I see the idea of cognitive unloading appropriate activities to other healthcare providers, such as pharmacists. Great idea, particularly in the hospital setting. And just to go with that a little more, there's interest in how we can do cognitive unloading for EMS, for places that have long transport times. The role of an enhanced direct medical oversight and is another way to potentially tap into cognitive unloading and helping the potentially frightening transport of an ill or injured child be less frightening and more effective when those of us who care for children more frequently can help our colleagues who are on their own in the back of an ambulance. I see a message from Kevin McCulley, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Pediatric Pandemic Network, and his comment about the PPN works closely with the Association for Maternal and Child Health Programs and the AAP Council on Children in Disasters. And that really highlights some of the important blending of federal resources with national organizations that are professional organizations. And maybe I'll invite all the participants. We've got maybe enough time for one question if someone wants to come off mute and ask a question or make a comment or augment what was said, because although I tried to portray the state of affairs even in an hour and with the time it took to make this talk, I have to acknowledge that there's a whole lot more going on in the federal space.
Dr. Jennifer Anders is a pediatric emergency medicine physician, an EMS physician in Baltimore, Maryland. For the past 20 years, she has worked clinically at the Johns Hopkins Hospital Pediatric Emergency Department and in EMS oversight at Maryland State Agency. Key EMS research topics include pediatric hospital capacities and EMS destination choices and pediatric out-of-hospital cardiac arrest care. And with that, Dr. Anders, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. And thank you to everyone who is joined in for the seminar today. And it's my first time on Zoom, so I just need to figure out how to share my screen. At least you would think it's my first time on Zoom. Anyway,
just let us know if you need any help.
Yeah, no, just the usual men to take me to the padded room, but now here we go. Hopefully that looks like a slide presentation.
Looking good.
So thank you for the invitation to present to this amazing group and in honor of Dr. Frogel, who I am not from the world of disaster in my primary niche of emergency medicine and EMS. I learned about him from the information that came out with this conference. And I am incredibly impressed by the number of areas of shared interests that I have, and very sorry that I did not have the honor to know or work with him. So I'm very, very pleased to be here in this conference in his name. So what I have come prepared to talk about today is what I call the crisis in pediatric bed capacity, and specifically how we manage pediatric inpatient acute care during times of surge. By way of disclosure, these are not specifically conflicts of interest, but some of this work was funded by a Targeted Issues Project grant from HRSA EMS for Children, as well as additional support from the Maryland EMS for Children State Partnership Grant. And in addition to being an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University in my academic life, I am also employed part-time by Maryland State EMS system. So please take my words as my own personal academic opinions and not as the views of either the US government or the state of Maryland. My objectives for this talk are to work together to look at and start to identify some of the challenges in both pediatric capacity, how many physical beds there are, and pediatric capabilities, how few hospitals are prepared at all to take care of pediatric patients, to think about ways that we can optimize utilization of the existing pediatric capacity that we have, as well as work cooperatively to figure out how to create systems that support pediatric emergency care needs, both for every day as well as in times of surge. So I'm going to start off with the most depressing news of the talk, and this should come as no surprise to most of the people gathered here today that pediatric care is disappearing. But over the last 20 years, more or less, we'll just say more than a third of U.S. hospitals that had pediatric beds have given up that capacity, and this is shared across every state in the country. If we look at this in slightly more rigorous or more granular terms, the location of pediatric beds has shifted over the last 20 years from communities spread out to where children live to primarily or more concentratedly being focused into freestanding children's hospitals and pediatric beds being lost at non-children's hospitals. At the same time, the loss of beds by closure of pediatric beds at non-children's hospitals has not entirely been offset by the increases in size at freestanding or non-freestanding children's hospitals. So there has been a significant net loss of pediatric beds across the United States over the last 20 years. Some researchers at Harvard came up with a very simple and yet incredibly profound way to start to talk about and think about this. And they defined what they call the Hospital Capability Index. And they define that as the probability that a hospital can complete the care that a patient would need. And very simple algebra to calculate this, they took the number of all patients seen in an emergency department that were not discharged home. So the ones that went to the ED, got their care, got discharged, we're not worried about them. Apparently they got what they came for. But they looked at those patients that were not able to be discharged. So they either had to be admitted to the hospital or transferred to a different hospital. And what portion of those non-discharged patients were actually able to be admitted to the same hospital where they presented for emergency department care. And they tracked this Hospital Capability Index across all the hospitals in 4 really big states: California, Florida, Massachusetts, and New York. And they compared how capable hospitals are at meeting the needs of adult patients. And the adult patients are represented here in the orange boxes, and how well the hospitals in each of those states was at meeting the capability needs of pediatric patients. And those measures are represented in the purple boxes. And you can see this, not surprising, but very dramatic separation of hospitals being able to meet the needs of the majority of adult patients. The average hospital capability index across all these 4 states was about 75% of the time adult patients were able to have their needs met at the hospital they first presented to. For pediatric patients, the average in these 4 big states was below 20% at all of the hospitals. And in some states, obviously Florida is kind of bringing up the bottom there. The median hospital capability index in Florida was below 10%. This is a pediatric issue. Adult patients can go to the hospital in town and expect that probably that hospital is going to be able to deliver them the care that they need, and pediatric patients simply can't. In addition to having a disparity between how equipped hospitals are to take care of adult patients and how equipped they are to take care of pediatric patients, not only is there this divergence, that separation in capability is growing. So over the course of, this is a little less than a decade of annual data where they looked at the average capability index for a hospital in one of these 4 states to deal with an adult patient, it drifted down by about 10% over the course of the 7 or 8 years of data that is represented here. At the same time, the average hospital capability to take care of pediatric patients dropped by about 25% across each of those 4 states. So there is a gap between hospitals being prepared to take care of adult patients and being prepared to take care of pediatric patients. And that gap is getting bigger and bigger as time goes on. And I don't have the data to present, but I would bet every cent I have that between 2013 and 2025, this has only gotten much, much worse. All right, so why is this happening? Some of the answers are obvious and they mostly have dollar signs attached to them. There are limited resources. The healthcare system in general is not doing super well. And so we have to make hard decisions. There are business people who are trying to figure out what is the best way to use the limited number of hospital beds that we have to help the maximum number of patients that we have. We don't have enough nursing staff, and that's only accelerated after the pandemic. And we have an acceleration of that because of the economies of scale. If I had a pediatric unit and I was able to give it 10 beds and I cut it down to a pediatric unit that only has 2 beds, well, now I am much less likely to keep enough staff to staff just 2 beds. I might as well hire more nurses to staff that med-surg floor that I attributed those other 8 beds to. And so as these pediatric units contract, it becomes more and more likely that they're going to contract even worse over time as expertise is lost. And I'm going to throw out one little Pollyanna, hope that there is something optimistic at play also, that in an ideal world, we would get better over time. And over the last 20 years, hopefully some things, we've improved strategies of care and improved systems. And now more kids with osteomyelitis are being able to be discharged home to be treated with antibiotics in the home rather than have to stay in the hospital on an IV for 6 weeks. I'm sure that there are some small incremental decreases in the need for pediatric hospital beds at all from innovations, but the overwhelming reason why is that pediatric medical care is just not reimbursed as well as adult medical care, and you're going to be able to make your hospital much more financially feasible, allocating your beds to adults rather than pediatric patients. I am from Maryland, and so I've got very detailed data that I look at and ponder over in Maryland. And I show this not because I expect anybody from outside Maryland to care about Maryland, but it is an illustration of the same thing that is happening all across the country. In Maryland, from 2003 to 2023, so this 20-year time frame, we had a decrease in pediatric inpatient bed capacity by a little more than a third. And when we track that out across the 5 administrative and EMS regions of our state, similar declines are seen across each of those regions. So we have very rural regions where they went from maybe 9 beds across the region down to 2 beds, and we have big urban area dominated regions where we had 75% of all the beds in the state, and they also had a decline of about 20%. So why do I care so much? Well, I care because I'm a pediatric emergency medicine provider, and I care about the health of children. But specifically, I care because of my interest in EMS and my role in EMS. And it is the job of EMS to work within regionalized systems of care and help to match the right patient to the right facility. We want EMS to get a patient with a major trauma condition to a trauma center. We want EMS to take an adult who is having a stroke or having a heart attack and get them to the appropriate kind of cardiac intervention center or stroke center or what have you. And I certainly hope that for pediatric patients, that means that EMS is going to do the job of transport medicine, of figuring out where a kid needs to go based on their medical needs and getting them there in a timely fashion. And so that is an everyday mission, but it butts right up against pediatric disaster preparedness, because one of the things about disaster preparedness is you can't get ready, or you can't deal with it after the disaster happens. You need to have systems that are established before the disaster happens, and you need to have an outline of what your capacities are and an understanding of where you're going to go in a disaster, so that when the flood or the hurricane strikes, you already have an understanding of what playbook to pull out and go to work. So this is where I'm going to diverge a little bit into my story time, because my foray into the world of disasters stemmed directly out of the work that I've been doing for some time in Maryland, obsessing about the pediatric capacity and the capabilities of Maryland hospitals for pediatrics. And when things were revving up in the pandemic, I got to play the role of a small scale disaster coordinator. So I want to take y'all back on a little time travel to the days when CNN, well, it was on in my house 24/7, I think, but there was that little ticker tape along the side of the screen or along the bottom of the screen that said how many new cases we've had today. I checked every day in my city's newspaper. They would list how many ICU beds were available today and how many ventilators were reported available at various hospitals around the state. We're all worrying about whether we were going to have to share ventilators between patients. And so I had an interesting prospect raised to me to say, all right, we are gearing up to figure out how we're going to deal with the COVID pandemic in Maryland. And Maryland was able to secure some federal funding and also some state government funding to post up what they called the Maryland Critical Care Coordination Center, the C4 program. And this was really, again, founded around how we were going to make sure we had enough ICU beds for all the adult patients with COVID. If we were running out of ventilators or ECMO circuits, how we were going to try and do triage and make sure that the resources went to the patients that needed them most. They set this up in a very short period of time during those early days of COVID with both combined federal and state funding. They hired themselves up a group of ICU physicians that were going to do sort of the triage management for this, and a set of paramedics who served as coordinators. And this was a telephone line where they took calls from across our state when people in community hospital EDs were looking for an ICU bed for an adult patient with COVID to try and get them to an open bed. And in the midst of that, it was a very successful venture. About 9 months into the project, they had weathered sort of the worst of our COVID waves that came through Maryland. And they started getting calls saying, could you help us out with a pediatric patient? At which point I got the call, and I said, you know what? I would love to help that. I was not particularly by the summer of 2021 expecting that COVID was suddenly going to hit pediatric patients, but I was 100% certain that there would, in the somewhat near future, be a respiratory epidemic in children, the flu, the RSV, one of those respiratory epidemics that comes around for pediatrics every couple of years. We have a bad year. And so we created what we called Maryland C4 Pediatrics. And our mission was a little bit different than our adult ICU doctor mission. We set up to aid in finding the most appropriate receiving hospital for any child who needs interfacility transfer of care. So because there are more different hospitals across the state of Maryland that have ICU beds than there are different hospitals that have even one pediatric bed, I said, it is hard enough to find any kind of pediatric inpatient bed. This ought not be limited to pediatric ICU beds. We're going to take kids that need any kind of inpatient admission. And we defined the most appropriate bed as a bed that met the medical needs of the patient, that followed with established patterns of care. We certainly didn't want to send people outside of a catchment area that they would ordinarily have gone in if they were affiliated with one of the existing large healthcare systems that overlap considerably throughout our state. And then we wanted to honor geographic proximity, so keep kids close to home so that mom and dad and grandpa and grandma can still drive to the hospital to pick them up when it's time for discharge or visit them or whatnot. And from there, we started out with a fairly scrappy, small list of assets. We had a telephone line. Our telephone line was recorded, and by recording calls, that obviated us from having to take notes to make medical records. The recordings served as our records of the conversations that we had with our callers. We had a coordinator who was a paramedic specifically staffing for pediatrics. We had what we called a Central Advisory Pediatric Physician, or a CAP. And we had a Google Drive. And on the Google Drive, the Maryland EMS for Children office and I put together a lot of resources that we had been gathering over the years about pediatric capabilities in the hospitals throughout our state. We also gathered a lot of things that had not previously been gathered, like we called and harassed people enough until we found a specific phone number or an ideal way to contact. We know you have a hospitalist pediatrician at your hospital, but you generally don't usually receive patients in. If I wanted to call hypothetically and ask you if you'd be willing to take an incoming transfer, what number would I call? How would I get a hold of the hospitalist who works at Community Town General? And so we had to navigate exactly whether we were going to call the nursing station on the pediatric unit or call through the hospital operator, or whether they had a beeper that they wanted us to call. We created smart sheets that allowed us to track every patient or every phone call that we got, who our callers were, what their location was, what the nature of the need was, and what the disposition was, that allowed us to track all the work that we were doing. And then in Maryland, we had already established pre-pandemic a health information exchange that in our state is called CRISP, that allowed us to be able to log in and see the lab results and the X-ray results, and in some cases, we'd be able to see the ED notes from a referring hospital that was looking to send their patient. We were able to see them if those notes had been signed. If the note was still in progress, we could just see the labs and X-rays and things. And that's what we started with. So in October of 2021, we were ready to launch, and we did this by sending out a little flyer that we had posted at all of our emergency department hospital base station radios, and we blanketed all of our ENA and ACEP and pediatric emergency medicine email mailing lists throughout the state, and just publicized our phone number and said, call us when you're trying to find a bed to transfer a child into, and the usual calls that you make aren't successful. We are here to help. And then we sat around and we waited for the phone to ring. And from October of 2021 through until May of 2022, the phone barely rang. So we were spending a good amount of money to pay our paramedic coordinators to be on call on the phones, and we were paying our critical care and pediatric emergency medicine physicians to be on call, and we were not receiving calls. So we were not, we were feeling a little bit guilty about the cost of this program compared to the amount of service we were providing. We had a little uptick in the summer of 2022. And then around shortly after Labor Day of 2022, the phone started ringing, and it did not stop. At which point I invoke this meme as representing my life, because when I say that phone did not stop ringing, there were days of being on shift for 12 hours as the CAP physician that we were having to mute our phone and listen to somebody giving report during our bathroom breaks, because we would be juggling 2 and 3 incoming calls at once, and not have the phone detached from our ear for the full 12 hours. Over the course of the respiratory surge in the fall of 22 into January of 2023, this was how our volumes went in Maryland specifically. I think everybody's experience in the triple-demic was a little bit different. Some people were slightly earlier. Some states experienced this slightly later, but we had a huge surge of calls that lasted for about 13 weeks. And then shortly after Christmas of 2022, as we headed into the early part of 2023, it was over, and we were able to go back to normal operational systems. While it lasted, though, we received a little over 1,400 calls into our Maryland C4 line. We got called by every emergency department in the state of Maryland. We got called by a good number of urgent care centers in the state of Maryland, and we got calls from outside our state, including a lot of calls from West Virginia, Delaware, from locations that typically do have a flux of transfer patients in and out across those state lines. We had some calls from Pennsylvania. We had a single call from New York because somebody knew somebody, and somehow it got to this hospital in upstate New York that if they were really desperate, they could call to Maryland. And as I recall, we were able to provide service, but we helped anybody who called and asked us. So our first phase of what we did with all of these calls and kind of mimicking the adult experience was to create new interfacility transfer opportunities. So one of the things that I had previously known was a reality of our transfer patterns in Maryland is that there are pediatric inpatient beds at a small number, not as many as I would like, but a small number of community hospitals out in the various geographic regions of the states. But in general, only the big tertiary quaternary care centers in the middle of the state have an intake line or a system that is easy to transfer patients into. So we wanted to provide the communication system so that when there was a patient whose needs could be met at a basic bread and butter pediatric capable facility, we were able to send a child who maybe had a low, a 1 or 2 liter oxygen requirement and did not need any high flow to a hospital that would not ordinarily have the experience or the infrastructure to accept interfacility transfers. And so we did quite a bit of that. We were able to transfer patients in state to our 3 big academic centers at Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, and Children's National Hospital, just over the state line into DC, but we consider it part of our Maryland network of care. We have a smaller children's hospital in Baltimore City at Sinai Hospital. And then the other 7 hospitals there are community hospitals that were not in the habit of taking transfers in, but they were able, with the help of C4, to make it happen and accepted a decent number of transfers. We also transferred a lot of patients out of state through transfer patterns that were new. You can see that we sent a significant portion, more than half of our patients that went out of state went to Virginia, and about a quarter of our patients who went out of state went to Pennsylvania. And both of those were fairly novel transfer patterns for us. We also were able to really allow this state government coordination center to help facilitate cooperation between our competing healthcare entities in the state. As previously mentioned, we have the Johns Hopkins Health System, we have the University of Maryland Health System, and we have Children's National Hospital System. And each of those hospitals has a standard sort of catchment area that they own and patterns of care that there was a lot of anxiety initially between the different corporations about, wait a second, is this C4 thing trying to hone in on our business plan? And as the triple-demic wore on, we instead were able to get those competing entities, as they all felt increasingly desperate with not being able to handle the number of requests for transfers in, to start seeing each other not as competition, but as partners trying to weather the storm together. So we created a lot of situational awareness of capacity, and we created a non-denominational clearing zone where each of those different ICUs could be calling into the C4 and say, all right, I'm going to have 2 patients discharged later today. Can you tell me what the top 2 patients on your priority list are at the C4? And we did some initial screening and helped to prioritize for resource utilization. rather than each of those individual siloed intake centers doing what I call responding to whoever's got the fastest fingers. And caller number 4, it's your lucky day. Your transfer patient gets the PICU bed. And instead, we were able to make sure that the sickest kid in the poorest outlying hospital situation got the PICU beds or got the inpatient beds as they became available. And we did that by creating some priority lists and some various tiers on our queue of open calls. So once we reached the saturation point and there were no beds to accept the patients into, and everybody was boarding everywhere, we began having our C4 pediatricians, when we made our follow-up phone calls at least once every shift, to check on what are the oxygen FiO2, what are the high flow settings for this patient, that kind of thing. Triage them into high, medium, and low acuity levels. And that took into consideration both the patient's needs, but also what the capabilities of the facilities were. So it made a difference if a child was on 10 liters of high flow at a community hospital that had some pediatric inpatient capacity, but was not at all comfortable with having kids on high flow, compared to a patient on those same settings who was at a freestanding ED where they had no pediatrician and they had no NICU that could come down and at least offer some sort of guidance on respiratory therapy needs for a child on flow. And so the child at the freestanding would probably get the bed ahead of the child that was in a more safe situation, even though they were both crying for help. We also, with those open calls on our queue, shared our situational awareness with the pediatric centers. And in a lot of cases, it was helpful to be able to say, there are 15 children currently on the queue, and your child is in the lowest tier of severity on our panel. It is unlikely that they are going to get a transfer out in the next 24 hours. We will be calling you back on the next shift. So at least those centers felt like they had some awareness of what was happening across the state and that we were all in the same boat. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, we did some selective triage when the PICU beds occasionally did open, and the PICUs worked heroically to try to get them open as often as possible, that we took the kids that needed it the most. And this, for me, is the real story that I tell about the triple-demic. A quarter of the calls that we got, about 400 in all, the patients managed in place, and they never got transferred. They never left the ED that first called and asked for help. And this young boy, his name is Jordan, and I share his picture. This is HIPAA compliant because he was on the front page of the Washington Post as Maryland's poster child, literally, or front page child for the triple-demic in Maryland. As you may be able to see there in the photo, Jordan is a young man. He is, I think, 16 months old in this picture with Down syndrome. He had a relatively minor cardiac defect with his Down syndrome. So he was what you would probably consider a higher than low risk patient, let's say. He is on high flow oxygen there. In this picture, I believe he was on 22 liters of high flow at the time. In every hospital in Maryland, that qualified him as being an ICU patient. He is in a community hospital here, and he sat in that community hospital where they cared for him very well for 7.5 days before he was able to be discharged home. And he went home in good condition. And the third page of the section of that he was on in the Washington Post was actually him and his family standing on their front porch, happy and healthy, and a success story. Because the third phase of things that we did as the triple-demic surge wore on was support our community ED and pediatric care providers. So early on, we realized that there was going to be a lot of high flow oxygenation needing to happen across the state in places that had zero prior experience delivering it. And so we developed guidance, a clinical practice guideline for physicians and APPs and bedside nurses that were working in those emergency departments that talked them through. How do you choose where to start your high flow? How do you start to wean it down? What are you selecting in terms of, can this patient be allowed to eat or drink at all on the high flow, or do they need to be NPO and get all of their hydration through an IV? And we provided that across all the various health systems to shorten the timeline to getting that information into people's hands. We served as a source of information regarding capacity throughout the region. So sometimes people called and they needed just a little bit of hand-holding or coaching or some expert guidance on how to manage a patient in their specific clinical situation. And we provided that kind of expert guidance. We didn't become the patient's physician, but we became the physician's angel on their shoulder. And then finally, we provided psychological support. Sometimes they called, they were exhausted, and all they needed to know was that there was a sympathetic ear that said, I know this stinks. It stinks at my hospital too, and we're going to hang in there together and get through it. And we got as many thank yous for the psychological support as we did for the management on how to provide critical care in the emergency department. So our high flow and when there was no room at the inn, and how we managed our open calls. I'm going to whiz through this and come to the denouement of my story time, which is eventually that triple-demic ended, and the volumes in the emergency departments went back closer to something that we recognized as normal. And at the end of it, we realized, developed or gathered an extraordinary cache of information about what hospitals in our region are actually capable of, who is going to rise to the occasion in a disaster and who isn't. And we developed for ourselves a roadmap for what to do next time. In the words of, actually, I'm not sure, it's controversial whether Winston Churchill actually said this or it's just attributed to him. We decided to never let this good crisis go to waste. So what can we take out of the experience other than the PTSD and learn so that we can do better for every kid in the state, both every day as well as into our next respiratory epidemic, which will come next year or the year after or sometime soon. So the major momentum that I chose to take forward was to take all that information that we gathered and pour it into Maryland's Pediatric Facility Recognition Program. So this is an offshoot of the National Pediatric Readiness Project, which is a joint venture of the AAP, ASAP, the Emergency Nurses Association, and the Federal EMS for Children's program. And every hospital across the United States is already asked to be a participant in the National Pediatric Readiness Project. About 75 or 80% of them typically participate by answering the survey that is sent out approximately every 5 years. It's a long-standing program, started back in the early 2000s, and is mandated in every state as part of their EMS for Children's program. In the last couple of years, the new performance measures for EMSC, though, have added, in addition to trying to get all of our hospitals and all of our emergency departments ready to take care of pediatric patients, we also have been tasked with developing a program to recognize what facilities are ready in our state or territory. And again, this matters not only because every emergency department should be ready to stabilize and save any child who rolls in their doors, but with 20 years of data, we can prove that making yourself ready by the definitions established by the Pediatric Readiness Project correlates with saving children's lives. So if we compare the highest quartile of readiness hospital to the lowest quartile of readiness hospitals, for kids that show up with one of a number of critical conditions, sepsis, cardiovascular, neurologic compromise, there is approximately a 4 times higher mortality rate for kids seen in the lowest quartile hospitals, or positively 76% lower mortality for kids that are seen in high pediatric readiness hospitals. For injured children, the difference is not quite as dire, but 60% lower mortality rate for injured children seen in hospitals in the highest quartile compared to the lowest quartile. And this is an old infographic, but a couple of years ago, they were doing the math and estimating that if every hospital could be pediatric ready, it would potentially save about 1,500 children's lives each year. And the latest numbers that they put out a month or so ago, I think it was up over 2,500. They estimate additional children might survive if every hospital was in a high state of pediatric readiness. The pediatric facility recognition criteria that have been established with the Pediatric Readiness Project include these 8 domains: coordination of care, staff training, quality improvement, safety, and policies, procedures, as well as having the necessary equipment, support services, and disaster planning and preparedness that addresses the needs of children. And this readiness we have taken in Maryland and put into 3 tiers of facility recognition. So for my money, I want every pediatric ED to be in that highest level of readiness. So our baseline entry level for our Maryland Pediatric Facility Recognition Project, if we take the Pediatric Readiness Survey, and if anybody is working in an ED and has ever taken the survey, it's a long survey. But the scoring metric is actually is available. You can find it. And I went through that survey and added up the points, and our list of criteria in Maryland for what I consider to be recognized as a pediatric ready ED in Maryland would get everybody up to the 90% score on the pediatric readiness survey. A pediatric resource hospital and a comprehensive pediatric hospital are contingent on having a pediatric ready ED, but I think it's also important that we recognize those hospitals that are able to care for pediatric inpatients, and we label that a pediatric resource hospital, and a hospital that is able to care for critically ill patients that is pediatric ICU capability, and we've labeled that a comprehensive pediatric hospital. So we have 3 sets of recognition criteria that include items across all the 8 domains. And we are currently in the phase of accepting applications from facilities, and we'll soon start going out to do our site visits and recognizing hospitals. Our goals in doing that are not only to provide facilities with recognition for doing important work and for being there and a resource for children, but also to give our Maryland EMS for Children program a chance to support them to get more ready and bring everybody up to a high readiness level. And then at the end of the day, once we know who is ready, we need to be very transparent about providing that information to physicians, EMS, patients and families, and let everybody know here are the hospitals that are capable in our state of taking care of children that need ICU care, taking care of children that need inpatient care, or these pediatric or these emergency departments are ready for pediatric patients. So again, every day we need to be able for EMS to get children to the right care when it counts. And the very personal reason why I'm so invested in this is developing tools for EMS to do that has been my major work over the last 10 years or so. And we developed what we call the PD tree, or the Pediatric Decision Tree, in Maryland as an evidence-based guide for destination decision-making. So the folks in the back of the ambulance can tell the driver of the ambulance where to take the child that they may have there in the back of the ambulance with them. And this tool is a guide that both refers to specific types of facilities based on their capabilities. So do they have an ICU? Can they provide inpatient care? And then also provide specific types of conditions that can be identified by EMS that would indicate a child is going to be best served or have a high likelihood to need an ICU, an inpatient bed, or conversely, to not need them, in which case they can go to the closest hospital and they don't need to be over triaged and crowding up the scarce resources at the comprehensive center. So we developed this back in the late 2010s, and in our implementation rollout, what we found was after implementing the PD tree and rolling it out to pediatric or to EMS in Maryland, our total increase in the number of pediatric transports, we had an increase in those that bypassed the closest ED. So before the PD tree existed, this was just the judgment of the EMS providers. About 40% of them bypassed the closest ED. After we implemented this decision tree, about 50% of pediatric transports bypassed the closest ED. But that is, this is good news, because when they bypass the closest ED, for the most part, 10% increase in total bypass, but 15% increase in the number that went to a regional or a resource facility. So instead of going from a rural location all the way to the big brand name children's hospital downtown, they went to those somewhat overlooked regional facilities that have general pediatric care, that are a lot closer to the patient's home, a lot closer to where that EMS unit is being dispatched from. And so we had a grand total over our pilot agencies of about 600 fewer transports going to the highest level facilities, which was a decrease of about 15% of the transports that were going to the higher level facilities. So this tool has made it out of the research phase, and at least in Maryland is being implemented as our statewide protocol. And as of yet, as I mentioned, we have just put out our call for applications to hospitals to get themselves officially registered as comprehensive or resource level hospitals, as well as pediatric ready EDs. But the vision here is in the years to come, hopefully by sometime in 2026, I'll be able to publish not only this as an official state protocol, but also to go hand in hand with it, a list of a number of facilities that are out there and officially recognized to meet each of these tiered levels of need for the patients. So every day, access to pediatric acute care is in a state of distress. I think it's important, no matter where we live across the country, to identify what the pediatric capacity is in your region, to know the capability of the pediatric facilities in your region. And I think it is incumbent on those of us that are in sort of leadership or in privileged positions of knowing this information, to share that information, to share it with families, to share it with pediatricians who need to refer to these hospitals, to share it with emergency departments that are looking for interfacility transfer locations. And when a surge comes along, and in the case of pediatric care, a respiratory surge is certainly not too far around the corner, we need to recognize that as our pediatric capacity is contracting dramatically across the country, we don't have surge capacity anymore. And so when the disasters happen, this is already a crisis on good days, and in a disaster, we've just put it into overdrive. So this is an example from Maryland of how a regional cooperative can help alleviate a surge crisis. I implore everybody to identify pediatric capabilities in your town, and when you're planning a disaster tabletop drill, not everybody can say, like, well, I'll just send all the severe kids to the big children's hospital downtown, because there may not be enough room in the inn to receive them all. And we need to simultaneously come up with ways to figure out how we're going to use all the resources available to us, whether that is community, hospital, beds for pediatric care, whether it is sheltering in place in emergency departments, and facilitate the interfacility cooperation across whole regions. And I have to acknowledge that I am here talking, but I did not do any of this alone. It was a labor of love with a whole lot of very capable people being integral to the success. So I am happy to answer questions if there are any. We have a few minutes before Dr. Harris is going to take over.
Please feel free to raise your hand. We see Marie Lozen, and also use the chat if you have any questions. Go ahead.
Oh, I have chatted vociferously during Jen's talk. Really excellent discussion. I think a lot of us are trying to do this both in our states, our regions, regionally, and the call to action is getting louder and louder. I posted a link to Matt Davis's paper from a few months ago about a national plan for access to pediatric care. You know, Mark Cicero's talk this morning, looking at that, creating a web of relationships, so we're all not working on the same thing in our states and reinventing the wheel. We're doing in Michigan, we just convened a massive discussion, which we've been doing since the triple-demic of pediatric critical care safety net. Same situation you're doing, same process. But you know, trying to inject data analytics to predict when the ICU beds will run out, which are actually pretty robust. So if we could share all these things, I see you've done excellent stuff with your EMS folks. One EMS story that I think you would like is that one of our jurisdictions, one of our big MCAs, developed a just-in-time emergency protocol to transport on high flow, which opened up more opportunities to actually transport. So these, I mean, almost like a clearinghouse of these best practices and a national plan to create that regional critical care safety net or care safety net for children, you know, for using every tool that you talked about is just really important. And I think that'll be the next decade's challenge in pediatrics as the pediatric workforce contracts. You know, we can't get people to go into pediatrics. As the nursing workforce contracts, and as those bed spaces continue to become a scarce resource. So great work. I just wanted to congratulate you.
This is happening everywhere. And we worked really hard, and you know, I feel very fortunate in a way that we were in the right place at the right time. We had been asked to set this up, and I was like, sure, I'll take your money. It'll be a fun little project. And there was no way, if this had not been up and running before the triple-demic hit, that we would have had a snowball's chance of putting anything together in a time frame to be useful. You can't prepare for your disaster after it starts. You've got to have things set up before it starts. And so eventually the money ran out, and we closed the C4 down as a 24-hour phone line about a year ago. But I took as much as possible and said, what can I keep going for free? What have we learned? And sharing between all the various projects where people are working on these same things, I think is absolutely the way to make the scarce dollars that we have get us the most bang for the buck, and try and do the most good.
Looks like we have time for probably one more. So Terry's hand is raised. Please feel free to unmute and go ahead, and then Matt, we'll give it to you.
Dr. Andrews, certainly appreciate your efforts. I guess my short and quick questions is, what strategies are you using to get C-suite buy-in? That's the challenge that we've had, is getting C-suite buy-in from the community hospitals, because historically pediatrics doesn't make money. So again, what are your strategies, your advice to get those sorts of buy-ins?
So it's one reason that I advocated strongly enough that we were able to get our pediatric recognition project. So our readiness recognition in Maryland is going to be tiered, and we have 3 hospitals that I expect to, 3 hospitals have ICUs. I could have Googled and told you which 3 hospitals had ICUs. It's that one's not really too hard to figure out. And nobody was getting ready to close their ICUs. Those hospitals are kind of boring and stable, right? We have 12 hospitals that say they have pediatric beds on paper. I know, gosh darn well, that 4 of them are just flat out lying. They haven't admitted a pediatric patient in years. And there are other hospitals that do have pediatric units, and they keep hospitalists there 24/7, but they're vulnerable. And so my main goal has been putting the recognition program out and getting the C-suite at those hospitals that have the capacity and have the capability to have them recognized. And then once they are recognized and they are on sort of an official list, I have hope that that will be some incentive to keep themselves there. And if I want to move quickly enough, that hopefully my goal is in the next 5 years or so to start to move this from a voluntary recognition program into an official designation. And once you're an official designated pediatric center, then we have some teeth in the state code to stay there. And if you're going to drop that level of service, you've got to justify it to your community and have some hearings and things like that, the same way that level 1 trauma centers aren't allowed to just give it up because they don't feel like doing it anymore. Whereas pediatrics, that's all they have to do. We've had hospitals in Maryland that decided on Tuesday that as of Thursday, our pediatric unit is going to be closed. And there's nothing anybody in the state can say boo about.
Thank you so much. Excellent discussion. Matt, did you still want to give everyone a couple minutes of a break, or do you want to go right in?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's been a great and long afternoon. Want to give everyone 5 minutes to get coffee or bio break, and then I don't think I'm going to use the full hour anyway, so people can get home to their families. But that's a tough act to follow. Thanks, Jen. But a wonderful act to follow. So let's give everyone 5 minutes. We'll come back at 5:07, and then we'll close out.
Sounds like a plan. Thanks, Matt.
Of course. John, what I will do is I'll share my screen just to make sure it's up and working.
Perfect. And then when we go back live, I'll introduce you briefly, and then it's all yours. Take it
Yeah,
home.
no problem. You got it.
You know, for those people who are still listening, I just want to mention, you know, we're just not tracking and trending this data enough when we have the capability to actually do it. We did it in COVID out of necessity as far as that's concerned. And so if we do not have the situational awareness that we are need to be able to track and trend. When I was an EMS director at the county level, I knew my bed capacity, I knew my ICU capacity, and I had data systems to monitor that. And I knew when we were going to have a surge, and these things became predictable based on what was going on in the community. And that was so valuable. And my partners in the other counties who were EMS directors had similar data systems to do that. So when there was an incident that would cause a surge, we were all able to come together very quickly and be able to facilitate medical transportation and destination in coordination with the hospital. So there's many values to having ongoing situational awareness in terms of bed capacity. And we need to stop dealing with snapshots and deal with trend analysis.
Yeah, I totally agree, Pat. I think the other thing that, Marie hinted to, and I think it's been a common theme here, is that, preparedness is like not proprietary, right? If one local hospital fails or system fails, everyone's going to fail. So I think that that's certainly something we struggle with here in New York, which I'm going to mention. But I think, these examples of these mocks are where we need to be. And right. And I think Marie's done great work in Michigan, and obviously Jen's done just a lion's share of work in Maryland. All right, so we'll give everyone a few minutes and then we'll get started.
Okay, Matt, good to go? I'm just going to introduce you very quickly. So I'd next like to introduce my dear colleague, Dr. Matthew Harris. He's a pediatric emergency medicine EMS physician with Northwell Health at Cohen's Children's Medical Center in New Hyde Park, New York, which is in Queens. Matt's triple board certified in general pediatrics, pediatric emergency medicine, and EMS disaster medicine. He's been involved with emergency medical services since 1998, beginning as a volunteer EMT, later paramedic, and of course an EMS physician. He serves as the medical director for Cohen's Children's Pediatric Critical Care Transport Team and associate director for the Northwell Center for Emergency Medical Services. He also sits on the New York State EMS for Children's Advisory Committee and has held key leadership positions in the American Academy of Pediatrics and National Association of EMS Physicians. And with that said, I'll turn over the mic to you, Matt. Take it away.
Okay. My apologies. All right, let's get to it. So thank you guys. This is as I mentioned, a tough act to follow with some real leading experts and mentors of mine in the field. I don't know if Jen had to hop off. I think that all of us who work in children's hospitals are looking forward to today working to say, the inn is closed, the inn is full. But that might be the title of another lecture at another time, because the inn actually never closes and we're never full. Is my guess. I see Marie's agreeing. All right, so we started today honoring Mike's legacy and looking at a very global view of preparedness for children and the deficits that have existed and that this group has conquered and really mitigated over the years, but also with recognition of the lion's share of work that's ahead of us. We understood from Dr. Cicero the sort of federal infrastructure that exists that I think many of us are engaged in. So whether it's grant-funded work directly from the government, whether it's through organizations like the Pediatric Pandemic Network or EMS for Children, we're all, I think, critically engaged in this type of work. Chip spoke at length about the opportunities we have to continue to mitigate against some of the behavioral health challenges we face, both for individual patients, but also globally with the dearth of beds. And obviously, Dr. Andrews really hit home for all of us, thinking back to the triple-demic and how we should use a good crisis, right, to help generate those next steps. So I'm going to take where we started at a national level and how we've become more and more focused. And in this last sort of 45-ish minutes, really make this a hyper-local moment for how do we build pediatric MCI programs at the level of the local hospital. And while I'm going to reflect the experience we had at our tertiary center for children in Queens, my hope is that the lessons that we learned and the knees that we skinned and the mistakes we made along the way to get to where we are offers opportunities for improvement for any hospital, whether it's the mega children's hospital, the community center, and of course, everything in between. So thank you for the opportunity, and I appreciate everyone being on here for this last talk here. I have no financial relationships, but I've got lots of kids. So I'm always looking. So we're going to talk about the need for a guideline, right? So MCIs are one of these things that until it happens to us and we go, oh my gosh, we weren't ready. It's like a back burner issue for most people in the C-suite. For those of us in EMS and emergency services and the emergency department, we're constantly on the ready for these things. But how formal we are, how often we practice these things has a great degree of variability, both within individual institutions and certainly within larger regions and systems. What are the decision points that help generate that guideline? And then really importantly, it's an iterative process, right? So writing a guideline once, for those of us in emergency management, just writes a guideline once, and you have something in paper, goes on a top shelf, collect the box, print out your ICS document, and you're ready. No, right? I think everyone on this call is ready to recognize that it's truly an iterative process, and how can we use this to drive future work moving forward? So just a brief introduction to Cohen Children's, which is part of Northwell Health, which is originally based out of Long Island, but now we're actually in like 5 counties and 2 states. And I think like a lot of other large health systems, this is wonderful, but also an incredible challenge to say, how do we create sustainable pediatric readiness now across 28 hospitals, not just the mothership Children's Hospital? And that's a challenge that, my colleagues in Colorado face with their several children's hospitals, and I'm sure in Michigan and everywhere it's represented here. Think from sufficient good to great, all of us probably fall somewhere between sufficient and good at a children's hospital, and that role gets a little bit more diminished as you get down to our adult centers and our community centers. And that's where I think we are looking forward to, leveraging the expertise of this group and the PPN to build our readiness as a hospital, but also as a system in a region. We're, for New York, a big hospital, we see about 72,000 kids a year in the ER, lots of visits, I think, like everyone else here. I put this slide in here from a recent trauma accreditation. We were just reaccredited as a level 1 trauma center, but just like everyone else, our traumas are going through the roof. So actually, talking about MCIs a decade ago got no traction, but have a rollover MCI with rollover car with 12 patients over the summer, great way to get the conversation started about why we have to be ready. So again, never lose the opportunity a good crisis affords to having these discussions. You've heard, I think, from John during the introduction about our experience here in New York City and how there's frankly, always an opportunity to re-bang on that bell and say, we need to be ready. So whether it was the full-scale evacuation of Bellevue during Sandy, I was a third-year resident in the PICU and thought it was a joke when someone called me to say we're getting 30 patients. Whether it's just last summer, a Farmingdale, a Long Island bus just actually crashed in upstate New York with 55 children on it, right? With 2 deaths, and both were adults with several critical children. We've heard about the experience that Chip talked about with Sandy Hook. And then really for me, the Bronx fire, which I don't know how much national attention this got, but locally, this kind of makes the hair on my arm stand up. 69 patients from this, level C event in New York City, which has only had 3 level C events in the last 30 years, and 16 deaths, 9 of which were children, right? And so, and most of those patients actually did not go to the right site initially, though I don't think that portended to their outcome, but there's clearly an opportunity for engagement locally to improve outcomes for kids from bad events. That's a lot. Where do we start, right? How do we get to that level of excellence that we've seen with our centers of excellence in PPN, et cetera? Now, one of the problems that I think we all have to, I'm just gonna put this whole thing up for a second. One of the problems that I think we all have to recognize is that for our local community organizations, for our C-suite, for people who are engaged in doling out money and other assets, pediatric preparedness comes and goes, right? I assure you that all of your hospitals after Sandy Hook, what is your plan? What is your plan? What is your plan? Let me give you money. Let me give you FTE. And then people took advantage of that, which is great. And then thankfully, nothing happened, or I shouldn't say it, dozens of things happened, but nothing enough to make the news nationally happen for quite some period of time. And then Marjorie Stoneman happened. And then all of a sudden, what's our plan? What's our plan? What's our plan? So what we need to do is capitalize on these horrific events to say we have to have a steady state. We can't be reactive. We need to understand and exercise what our plan should be in preparation for these events and not in response to them. Though I'm preaching to the choir here, though our C-suites don't see this, right? And I think I have some C-suite representation on the call now, so I hope I still have a job tomorrow. But this is really, really important to know that we have to look at this as our mission to be ready for these. Okay, all right. So taking zero credit for this amazing, amazing toolkit, right? And we've heard a lot about the opportunities from Marie and others. If we walk out of today with anything, right, it's that we have, and this has been Pat and George and Mike's dream with the National Pediatric Disaster Coalition, share resources. Don't reinvent the wheel. So this came out a number of years ago, right, in 2022, and this is the foundations that anyone could use, right, free open access checklist to the fundamental things you need for an MCI guideline. Now, that being said, we wrote our guideline in 2021, so it didn't have this benefit, but I'm going to use the template of this checklist to kind of walk you through retrospectively what our process has been since then, and encourage all of you guys to download this. It is the building blocks for a pediatric preparedness process. Okay. What are your goals? What are your expectations? And I will tell you, as an emergency department physician, one of the problems with having an ER doc write this is that my original plan was a really good guideline for the emergency department, right? And so it was great. I'm gonna strain my shoulder, patting myself on the back. It was awesome, except it didn't include anybody upstairs, and we don't typically go upstairs, right, as ER docs. But what is the capacity of the hospital to absorb these patients? What is the ICU doing? What is blood bank and pharmacy and all these key stakeholders? So please learn from my much younger version, more haired version, mistake of getting appropriate engagement. So the checklist talks about where do you want to be, and that's important to understand where you are. Do you want to be where I think most of us now are at children's hospitals at that intermediate to advanced level, right? You are the children's hospital in your region, and so you need to be at the top of your game. And maybe you're already at that foundational to intermediate level. So where you're going depends a lot on where you are. Or are you a new PEC in a community setting and you're trying to figure out where to start? Because before you can have the multiple tiered response to an emergency, bringing in resources from outside, pre-credentialing people, maybe we should understand what the resources are that are immediately available 24 hours a day to facilitate the response to those 4 critical kids who show up before we worry about the tornado. So understanding where you are, that institutional introspection is really, really critical. Okay. So our goals locally were, we didn't have much of an infrastructure. Now, we had a plan, right? There was a plan on paper that someone wrote at some point, but it didn't really delegate. It kind of defined what an MCI was. It sort of defined who the players were, but who rings the bell, right? Who's empowered to get the cavalry moving? Who can say we're stopping normal OR processes? All those things existed, but they were never unified under a plan. So the chief of surgery can say, we're stopping the OR, but the chief of surgery is on vacation. So who is his or her designee, and who am I as the MCI chair empowered to call, right? How do we engage and forget us, highfalutin docs, the poor nurse administrator, the HOA who's on overnight, are he or she empowered and educated to help make that decision when the C-suite isn't around and the normal EOC can't be opened, in 90 minutes, right? Is there a standardized process for activating MCIs, both from the outside and then internally? And I can tell you that we technically sit on the border of Queens and Nassau, so we say we're a Queens hospital, but if you come in the main entrance at Cohen's, you're in Queens. You sneak out the back door to go to 7-Eleven, you're in Nassau County. So when we get notifications about an MCI, sometimes the red phone rings and it's an automated message from the fire department. We've actually done a lot of work with Greater New York and our colleagues to update this recently. But Nassau County calls and says, how many patients can you take? So we have to educate the person answering that phone, who's calling, and what is the information you need to glean to make a decision. Because if you're going to ring the bell and get the cavalry, something better be cooking, okay? What is our capacity? I just have to move something off my screen. I'm sorry. What is our capacity, and can we reach, how many patients can we take at any time? And again, I'm being a little ED-centric here, but we'll feed into the larger picture in a moment. So I think I've worked clinically with some of my colleagues on the call here. I'm a black cloud. You want to give me 10 critical patients? I'm ready for you. My colleagues will take 1 critical patient, but the reality is you need to define that 24 hours a day, what can you always take, right? Not the cavalier doctor, not the conservative doctor, but 24 hours a day, we can accept 3, critical patients and 10 to 20 walking wounded. And to be fair, in 2018, I think Dr. Redlener is on here, can correct me. 2016, 2018, New York City moved to a fixed allotment system for their hospitals. Based on their levels of MCI activation from the fire department, you can take 1 critical, 3 critical, 6, 9, and then 10, 20, 30, et cetera, based on your ED volume per year. Are you a trauma center for adults or kids? So there is a data-driven approach, not just the gestalt of the ER doc who is working. You have to formalize this into an operational plan, and then you have to maintain readiness. So let's get further into this. Okay. Sorry, this keeps popping up my Zoom here. Let me just move this out of the way. All right. So in order to get the right stakeholders, you have to have like a set plan of doing this, right? So we had our MCI committee chair and our emergency management chairs. Those were combined, right? Because those processes surge, all this sort of builds off the same principles, and people are meeting out after COVID, right? So to have a meeting about surge, a meeting about MCI, when it's the same people and the same stakeholders, doesn't make sense. Get the right people in the room at the right time. And then divide and conquer. And this is problematic. And actually through the PPN and through the DNC, one of the challenges has been, understanding what FTE is allocated in each children's hospital to support this type of work. So, when you put up your TO in front of your C-suite and go, hey, I'm not actually brought down at all to do this, but I've got to collaborate with 15 different stakeholders, or we're not going to be ready. That gets the attention of C-suite administrators. Anytime you say we're not going to be ready, we're going to make the news and not for the reason we want, that tends to get some attention. Get the support of your trauma teams, hospital operations. At the end of the day, this is about capacity management, right? We can all take care of sick kids for the most part, but where they're going, when is the inn closed, when you open up the closets to get patients in, and then you have to empower local cheerleaders and excuse me, not cheerleaders, losing my English here. You have to empower local champions. I knew there was a CH in there, local champions, but not just clinical champions. Our blood bank champion for MCI is like amazing, and came up with novel solutions for mass distribution of blood while still maintaining all those important, matching patients to specimen, et cetera. And we would never have figured that out on our own. So it's not just the clinical folks, but who in EVS can figure out how to get you more beds. So in my infinite wisdom, there's some sarcasm here, I went up to the PACU and I said, great, we have 40 PACU beds that are monitored. I can increase the capacity of the ED like this with 40 beds. But there are 2 elevators that go down from the PACU to the ED. So how quickly can you get 40 beds down? We tried this and it was like 9 hours. So, right. So understanding those local champions keeps you honest, and then get them together and put teams together that are going to work together. Yes, we want someone from the ED on every one of these committees, but the reality is lab, courier services, blood bank, These are people who have processes in common, so getting them together on committees and then allowing them to exercise their professionalism and their expertise in reporting up. It also just builds team dynamics as you do this. Okay. So those are the key stakeholders you're talking about. So I mentioned before, so this is how we do this, again, from sufficient good to great. I think this is good, could be better, but we break down into sort of 5 subgroups, and each of these groups meets quarterly and then reports out biannually because everyone's meeting out. And thankfully, a lot of this doesn't change very frequently. So we have our acute care medical, right? This is everyone from the ED up to the PICU and everything in between. And frankly, even our neonatologists, which are mentioned on the third one here, they're a critical part of this. They are pediatricians, right? For little tiny people, but they're pediatricians. And if we need more bodies to staff a medical MCI, they could go back up the hospitalist. Maybe the hospitalist can come down to us. We're talking about hours of care, not days and days of care. How do you educate trainees about this, right? We have 1,800 residents in Northwell Health. How do we train and maintain competency in not just pediatric response, but global emergency response? This is a huge army of people. So get them engaged in drills. You'll get 1 or 2 residents who are like, this is what I want to do. And then they can replace all of us gray-haired and balding people at some point. Acute care trauma, exactly what it is. OR, peri-op, trauma services, anesthesia. And there's been some really interesting work out of that group about, originally a lot of our surgeons were responding to the ER. I don't need 10 surgeons in the ER. I need 5 surgeons upstairs and I need a couple surgeons downstairs, because ultimately, if we have a bunch of kids that need to go to the OR, I don't want to lose my 1 surgeon downstairs. I want him or her to say, this one to OR1, this one to OR2, this one to IR, this one to PICU. And then you can see, really, perhaps more importantly than the clinical teams, our ancillary clinical, our operations, and our support services. Again, we really tried to group committees together, grow these committees organically based on the people they're most likely to interact with in real time. And some really interesting work has come out of it. So those are your internal partners, but your external partners are really, really important. Actually, one of our community sites, really, really smart. They said, we don't have the ability to really, 15 kids showed up in the back of a truck after an accident. We don't have the ability to mobilize a lot of resources. But we have lots of local volunteer ambulances. There's 119 agencies in Long Island. There's actually more fire trucks on Long Island than there are in New York City. It's all whatever. But there are 119 EMS agencies on Long Island. So while one agency might be involved in MCI, the plan at this local hospital, if they need to increase their triage capacity, they've worked it out with the local volunteer squad and the town over. They'll send EMTs to come do jumpstart and start at the front of the ER, just as a way of increasing and sort of force multipliers. All of these plans require law enforcement engagement. Hard stop, right? These are the people who are going to keep you safe. They're the ones who are going to help you track and be part of your reunification plan. So the first 4 groups here are really obvious. What was less obvious to us actually is the bottom group here. This has become really critical as a trauma center. And these are what we call our violence interventionalists, right? This has become a really hot topic, but they should be part of your MCI plan, because a lot of our MCIs in Queens are multiple kids being shot out in a party where they probably shouldn't be, right? So how do we engage them in the ER in the moment actually is just as important during an MCI as it is when they come in as an individual person who's been the victim of violence, whether it's penetrating or blunt. Okay. Oof, writing the guideline. Okay. So, you have to put this stuff down on paper at some point, right? But the problem is it starts off. So my first guideline, I don't know if Kathleen Adelgase is on here, she'll make fun of me. My first guideline that we wrote for this was 22 pages. It was amazingly difficult to read, right? And meant nothing. It was great on paper. And I was like, look at this tome. It's a masterpiece. But that's what it was. It was 22 pages that no one was ever going to read. So then we said, let's trim down, right? And keep it local. But ultimately, what we really want, honestly, guys, is you need your guideline, which is great. That could be 22 pages. But what is the local incident commander going to open up? They need job action sheets, right? Tell me what to do first, right? Tell me what to do second. Who do I assign responsibilities to, right? And so a lot of times in emergency preparedness, when we talk about a command center, an emergency operations center, an incident commander, that's great when everybody shows up from home. But actually the incident commander in RER for that first 90 minutes is the charge nurse, right? You don't need me as the ER doc doing it. You want me inside taking care of kids, but the charge nurse knows what's going on in the hospital. They have that 30,000-foot view of what ORs are open, what PICU beds are open. They're already moving the chest pieces, right? I can never get my appy upstairs, but if there's a trauma, they can get upstairs like this. So it made sense for them to be that incident commander with a 30,000-foot view. But we've become very, very prescriptive. And actually, this is an outdated slide. We've really cut this slide down in half because the 5 things they need to do are ringing the bell, handing out the vests, assigning a triage officer, assigning logistics officers, get back to that in a second, and then creating situational awareness. All right, guys, this is what's happening. This is how we're going to disseminate this information. Let's do what we've been practicing. Take a breath and let's go. All right. Excuse me. I'm coughing because I'm allergic to ICS. Excuse me. So we do still require ICS courses throughout the nation. So I don't know if anyone is like a big ICS fan. They're great, and they were great when we wrote them 50 years ago for firefighters in California. They mean this to frontline staff providers. Nothing. It's vernacular. That's all it is. So what we need to figure out, and what I challenge this group to do, is how do you take the basics of 100, 200, 700, 800, and bring that down to the frontline nurse, the frontline ER doc, and go, okay, I have a role. I have someone I have to report to. Maybe it's not the vernacular that FEMA requires me to use, but and actually FEMA and Joint Commission recently changed this, right? Instead of saying you have to teach ICS, it says you have to have a system and teach to it. You could be the grand poopah of MCI, as long as they know who the sub poopah is and the digital poopah. Anyway, so we have really worked to make sure that people understand their roles in our hospital, in our system, and we're really trying to move away from these classes, but you do have to give them a foundation. But what we did is we said, not everyone has to have this. The charge nurses and our ANMs or assistant nurse managers who will play the role of incident command, I do want them to have this foundational education, because when the fire chief shows up, sure as heck, they're going to say, who is the incident commander? Where is your triage officer? Where is your command and coordination center, your crisis coordination center? So they have to have some of that vernacular, because our police, our fire, our EMS, our military, we still use this language. So you can't really throw it away, but you can change it to make it meaningful to the end recipient. Okay. Working out the kinks. Okay. Really 1990s level animation here. The guideline has to be iterative, right? So we wrote our initial guideline in 2021. We revised it in 2023. It's been 2 years. I mean, we revise our sepsis guidelines every 2 years. You need to revise these guidelines. Things change, right? We're seeing, I think Pat posted a paper from 2020, from last year, like new data comes out, so we can be data-driven and evidence-based. And, I do a lot of event medicine, and we like send the same number of EMTs and medics to every event. And I go, guys, what's the weather? What kind of music it is? There's great studies about this, about predicting resources. Because if you send 200 people to your MCI, who's coming if this process goes on longer than expected? And we've fatigued everyone who's shown up. So everyone wants to help, but being prescriptive about who shows up is a really important part of this process. So get a guideline committee, put it on the calendar. The guidelines should be formal, right? They should go to your whatever mechanism you have in your hospital. This is a clinical guideline, right? And it should be reevaluated every 2 years and make sure that what you wrote still works. I mentioned before that New York City, under Dr. Mike Redliner and the Greater New York Hospital Association and several other partners, moved to these levels several years ago, and again had these fixed allotments. What was an oversight back then is they didn't have pediatric allotments. They just said what the hospital can receive, but a critical 3-year-old is not a critical 30-year-old. So we're really pushing out now better situational awareness for pediatric hospitals about what's happening, and we're encouraging internal discussions. Now, in our neck of the woods, there's really no freestanding children's hospital. All of us, even though we have our own buildings and our beautiful logos, we sit on a campus with an adult hospital. And so you have to think about the shared resources, because if there's a big event, barring God forbid, another Sandy Hook where it's really an isolated pediatric event, lots of adult patients are going to show up too. So to say, I'm going to take 30 critical peds, well, what about next door? Are they going to get 50 critical adults? We have the same respiratory, same blood bank, same lab. So you have to ask yourself, it's not just about the big, beautiful freestanding children's hospital 5 miles away from the adult center, but how do you respond as a campus? Totally different and kind of exciting problem to try to solve. Okay. This is kind of in that sufficient to good category. We recognize that there are times we want people to know that something's cooking, but I don't want everyone to show up, right? You cry wolf too many times and people are going to get annoyed and get fatigued. So we have created a bifurcated system where if we get a phone call that says, you know what, there's been a bus accident, right? We don't know what it is. It could be a rollover bus accident, like the one I showed you, or more commonly, the bus got rear-ended and there are 50 children on there, and probably someone's going to go to the scene and send them all home, right? Some sucker like me is going to have to go do that. But we don't know. But I don't want to stop the OR, right? I don't want to stop blood bank from putting out, the next unit. So we've created this bifurcated system where until we know patients are coming that are going to require the cavalry, we will put out what's called a pediatric code MCI notification only text. Hey guys, we've heard there's a large fire in the area. No patients are coming at this time. No response requested. Please don't call. We want to let you know that something's cooking. But as soon as we find out that there's even one patient coming, then we turn that to a response requested, right? Because then we need people to go, I'm not going to start this appy. I'm going to talk to blood bank and start thawing some product. Pharmacy's going to pull out their RSI kits and get them ready. Conversely, if we know, God forbid, there's an active shooter in a school, the bus has flipped, then we just pull the trigger, pun intended, I guess, right? To get people going. But you really want to only mobilize your cavalry, except during drills, which, by the way, all of our drills are unannounced. I'm really well liked because of that. But unless you're doing it for drills, don't call the cavalry unless you know patients are coming. It's just not, you're not going to develop good partnerships, and hospitals have to keep moving. Okay. This is just a glimpse of, we have a trauma bifurcation, a medical bifurcation, but the reality is our surgeons have reminded us they're doctors too, right? So if we have our last big event that was not traumatic was someone released bear spray into the air conditioning unit of a school, and they had 50 or 60 kids. Most of those kids were fine, right? Eye irritation, low respiratory distress. But really what we needed is lots of people to listen to lungs and irrigate eyes, right? So our surgeons were like, we can do that. So we're going to simplify this now that really it should be one uniform process, whether it's a traumatic event or a medical event. What's interesting is not in here, a little note to myself is, what's the potential for a big just behavioral component, right? And that's something that Chip spoke to a lot as well. All right. Your huddle is the most important thing that happens in those first few moments. Guys, we got a call. Let's get everyone up to the charge nurse desk for a second, have a quick moment. Now that might be, we're not expecting anyone, but if we do get someone, trauma 1 and trauma 2 are our first 2 critical rooms. And by the way, for trauma centers, this is what we do every day, right? But if you're not a trauma center, hey, let's keep room 1 open. Okay, who's going to be who's going to be the nurse who's going in? What doc's assigned to that room? Or, hey guys, we're expecting a bunch of patients. Let's clear out rooms 1 through 3. Let's move the patients in, the stable patients in the waiting room to the cafeteria and everything in between, right? So, but that huddle takes place locally, so you can understand what you need to do in the ER to create capacity. And then if you need to escalate above, we've set a very clear expectation that when the code MCI goes off, each unit is doing a quick huddle. All right, PICU, we're going to double up non-infectious patients in this capacity. Patients who are queued up for discharge from the floor are going to be taken to this lobby, and we're going to get them out the door, right? Because eventually we're going to need to get people upstairs. So the huddle we talk a lot about in the ED, but the reality is it's just as important upstairs and the clinical units, in the blood bank, in the pharmacy. So the huddle is built into the guideline. Huddle with your team. Have a conversation, assign specific roles. Don't call out needs to the room. Sound familiar? We've all done this before. We love our vests, right? We really, really love our vests. I made the mistake of assigning a white vest to our incident commander, except all of our nurses wear white. Dumb doc thing to do. So now that is a blue vest, and that's the only person in a blue vest. But what we've socialized to our hospital is anyone who's in red, and actually that should say attending physician or fellow. So if you walk down, if Marie walks in and goes, I need to find an attending surgeon, they're going to look for someone in red because that's a PEM, PICU, or surgical attending or fellow. Hard stop, right? You need help. If you need, now we have an RER, 1, 2, 4 main clinical areas, one of which is like the trauma bay resuscitation areas, but we had 1 logistics officer. But what if you have 3 people that need to go up to the OR? Who's coordinating that? So we actually now have a logistics officer in orange in each of our areas. Hyper local. I need blood. Marie, I need blood. Pat, I need to get this guy to the OR, right? So, sorry, Pat, I didn't mean to bring you back in. But the point being is that we recognize that lots of things have to happen at once, and 1 logistics officer, even if it's just a couple patients, isn't enough. So the logistics officer standing next to the incident commander is kind of their main logistics person, but then all the orange vests answer into that person. That's been something we've been finding very, very successful. You have to prepare your critical spaces. This is something that's actually really a nice kind of interesting academic thing to do. So what needs to stay in the room? Trauma bays are easy, right? But I will tell you, if you're planning on putting 3 trauma patients in, which was our original plan, even in places like CHOP, where I think they have 3 in a row, they're used to that. They're separated, there's barriers. We technically could fit 3. We have 2 trauma bays. We could fit 3 patients. It's a disaster. It's loud. People are bumping into each other. So it's actually like our redundancy plan to do that if the other 9 critical rooms we can open up can't do it. But the challenge is in your non-trauma bays, your non-resus bays, what needs to stay in the room? You don't need the extra chairs. You don't need the scale. You don't need the garbage pail, right? But you need a table for IV stuff. You need your IV cart. You need your critical medication. So each room is a little bit different. So figure out what comes out. And we have pictures that we've taken of what each room should look like. So in an envelope that sits there all the time, if I call the code MCI, my expectation is one of my colleagues is going to go out and put up all the pictures. So when our ER techs have to go set up these rooms, room 1, bed in the middle, table to the left, IV cart to the right. Room 2, bed to the left. So each room is a little bit different. Unintended consequence, where is all that stuff going? Your garbage pails and your scales, because you clutter like this. So you have to have a place where, room 30 is going to be full of all of our garbage cans and scales, right? So simple things to make your life a little bit easier. All right. And where are we going? So now we've talked about our goals, our stakeholders, writing the policy, making it iterative, working out the kinks, building capacity, but ultimately, where are we going for this and how do we set our drills? Okay. Again, you can see 1999 here. Okay. All right. So this goes back to a drill that is really proud of. We do an annual live drill that's preceded by a tabletop, that's preceded by a facilitated discussion. That's kind of just our methodology in doing this. Lots of different ways for this to work. And I will tell you, as boring as it may sound, we do the same drill every year. Because you know what? The clinical care doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, right? They like putting in chest tubes. They like looking at all these moulage patients. But I want to know that someone recognized an MCI, called the right code, put out the page, initiated the process. Like those are our metrics every single year. And then this year we added in, let's take 2 patients up to the OR. This coming year is reunification. The year after that, it's going to be multiple blood products. But that muscle memory component is every year. So yes, it would be cool. And if I had a ton of time in FTE, hint, hint, C-suite, to build a new thing every year, I'm happy to do it. But you don't need to. And that way we can use the same scenarios every year and not waste time writing 30 new clinical scenarios. Okay. So this was going to be on January 11th. We were super excited. We built a ton of stuff around this. We hadn't gotten a chance to actually test our brand new, beautiful 2-tiered code MCI policy. We had our SMART objectives. How do we identify? How do we mobilize the cavalry? Let's get our incident commander identified. We were ready. Okay. So that's January 11th. That was the goal. 8 o'clock in the morning, during sign out, during rounds, really inconvenient, exactly when you want to make friends. Now, some people might know on this call is January 8th is my birthday. Okay. 43 this year. I know I don't look it. Thank you very much. But January 8th is my birthday. And at 4 o'clock in the morning on January 8th, I got a page that said, Cohen Children's Medical Center, Pediatric Code MCI, response requested, right? 4 o'clock in the morning, I winged over to my wife. I said, these guys at work, they're pranking me, right? It's 4 o'clock in the morning on my birthday. They're pranking me. So I'm like, guys, what's going on? They're like, Matt, a bus flipped over. I'll be right there. Now, the reality is I got a ticket driving there. Okay. So and also they didn't really need me to be there, right? I went to see what was happening, to see if all the work we had done, it was a red light ticket, by the way, I didn't get pulled over. But, and Nassau County is very stringent. But anyway, so I wanted to see that the policies that we put together, the process, that they were going to follow it. And I was really worried. We'd really set up and we hadn't done this in real life in all of its components. Okay. So I get there. And this is what I see, like visual music to my eyes, right? They were in their vests, right? These are 2 of our nurses. You can see this is still during one of the COVID spikes, and they were out there looking the part. All right. So this is we use a process called RAVE, which I think a lot of people use, and SPOC, which is a more detailed, sort of more finesse way of getting information out. So this is the timeline of things happening. In the end, there's only 3 patients, but anyway. Okay. But this is what I walked in to see. So what do we see? Attendings in red vests. So that's our fellow in the foreground, our 2 PEM attendings. 5 surgeons came in. That's not even in our plan. 5 surgeons came in from home. Our chaplain, one of our chaplains came in from home. Like I was mind blown. I mean, we were in IHOP afterwards talking about this. Yes, it's delicious. We were really impressed. And again, no patients can be seen here except for their foot. Everyone's looking the part. The person in the yellow vest is a critical access nurse. Because you know what we found out in setting up our policy? When nurses come down from the floor, don't poke fun at us. Our floor nurses don't do IVs and they don't have access to Pyxis. So when you throw just any nurse into a room, it's not helpful. But our transport nurses, our ER nurses, our PICU nurses, our NICU nurses, they can get lines in anybody. So the person in the yellow is either from transport, ED, PICU, or NICU, and they are the access nurse, right? Because they're the ones who are going to drop lines. So I was really, really thrilled to see what was happening. They're having a situational awareness huddle. Right? This is it. It's happening in real life. So in the end, we only got 3 patients. Thankfully, everybody did just fine. And I think a couple people went to the OR for orthopedic type injuries. But it worked, okay? And then they said, do we really have to do this drill? We just did this in January. Happy birthday. And the answer, of course, was, yeah, we're going to do the drill. So 3 days later, after we debriefed and figured out a couple of nuances of things that worked and didn't work, who didn't get a page, who was supposed to get a page, we put out, now this drill was unannounced, right? So they were really, we'll say excited. I think they'd have different words for this, to do this twice in the same week. This is, again, some of predetermining where we're going to put patients, right? And the QR code is how how responders check in when they get there. Now, that doesn't do anything for us in real time, which is something we want to work on. But when we want to do follow-up and make sure people have adequate emotional support and get their feedback on the process, this has been like gold, okay? So vests were signed out. You can see we predetermined where we're going to put our MCI carts. And by the way, your materials management people, your procurement people, geniuses, right? So I built these beautiful MCI carts, which would all expire, right? All the time. But now in our ER, when we have a trauma patient we put in a chest tube, they go restock from the MCI cart that never gets used. That goes into the ER, and then we restock the MCI cart. So we really, and now it's part of the checklist. So we actually throw away very, very little from our MCI carts. Okay. We muster in a really inefficient area right now. It's kind of like our rec area, which we evacuated other patients. We don't have a good place to muster. So please figure out a way to muster. And that might be people coming to the ER to help, should be different than when you're mustering people who are going to support the hospital. This is a real challenge for us. I don't have a great answer to. We had these standardized patients, and again, we made it as real as we can. So these are from our drill patients. We have photo consent for all of them. We do use children in our drills. This came up, I think, a part of the DRC evaluation. So most of them are teenagers, seniors from the high school. Some of them are my children who I force to do and then give them baseball cards. So, you know, you have to get their consent in some way, shape, or form. But we try to make it as hyper-realistic as we can. We moulage, and people find this really, really real. And I should say that when you debrief afterwards, part of it is that felt really real, okay? I'll mention that in the last 2 years, we've had a real critical patient come in smack in the middle of both of our drills. So having a safety officer whose job is to say, popcorn, 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 we're done for a minute. We stabilize that patient, then we went right back into the drill. So just remember that as you're doing this, life continues. This is just more patients from our drill. I will point out, anyone from the New York area will know that Northwell has a new CEO. So on the right picture on the side, the guy in the middle of the mask, that's John D'Angelo, is the new CEO of Northwell Health, to just show you how invested our health system is and our leadership is in being prepared for pediatrics. He's an ER doc by training and just a phenomenal guy. Please tell him that so I get a raise. Okay. And then there's your debrief, right? This is a really bad picture of me, right? This is a debrief, right? So we had our hot wash immediately after. Hey guys, we're done. We've met our objectives. We're going to de-escalate. We're going to stand down, right? And stand down is a really critical component of your MCI response, right? Because everyone's adrenaline's up. So having that moment and putting the page out overhead or through your paging system, that has to be very clear that we're moving into the next phase of this response, okay? And then we had a debrief afterwards. And again, that's obviously led into our after action reports and so forth. But communication and engagement is really, really, really critical. And recognizing and thanking the people for showing up, right? These 17 kids from the local high school and their teachers and their parents, right, for showing up and being participants. And that's one way of getting engaged. Okay. These are our lovely students here and their moulage. They look great. Okay. So what did we learn? So I think I've harped on this in that particular drill. our muster area leaves something to be desired. Where we're putting certain pieces of equipment was something we're iterative about. And then really what's really important here, the incident commander role, this fidelity problems with that, right? Because everyone's going to them because they know as the charge nurse, they're kind of the person that gets stuff done, but making sure people know, go to the person in orange for patient movement. The only person who can talk to the person in blue is a person in orange or a person in red, right? Keep them safe from the muck so they can see everything else that's going on. Okay. I kind of harped on this before. So where do we go from here? Okay. So internally, and I think I'm okay on time. Internally, we're focusing on reunification, which we're not very good at. I've got like 6 minutes, Sean. Okay. Focusing on reunification, hospital evacuation, which I think we have a good-ish plan on, but we've never tested. Decontamination, always a real critical issue. What is your HERT team? You know, how capable they are. And then, and I think thankfully, lots of people stole this thunder. Cohen's, as part of the Pediatric Disaster Coalition, now is the affiliate hub for the PPN. So I'm going to harp on this for a second, though some of these physical slides have been shown, so I'm just going to go through them quickly. So really what Cohen's and more importantly, the PDC is looking for, and we have so many people from FEMA Region 2. Let me just jump forward for a second. So FEMA Region 2, right? New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and US Virgin Islands. We're good in New York City. We're okay in New York City, right? Puerto Rico and USVI have very little capacity, but a ton of passion and a ton of ambition. And I've been meeting and begun to meet with their EMS for Children leadership. It's very clear, even just from the emails, that they're hungry for engagement, okay? So as we break into this next era of the New York City Pediatric Disaster Coalition as the FEMA Region 2 affiliate hub for PPN, my ask of this group, which obviously represents a more geographically dispersed, is partner with us, right? You know, Cohen's has the, you know, the technical name on the grant, but this is a PDC thing. And this is for our PPN colleagues. I know Kevin's on here. This is a first for PPN too, right? To have a non-children's hospital partner, right? Cohen's is supporting this with infrastructure, and we're very proud of that. But really, we're proud that we're using the foundational components of the coalition, right, to build. And we will have failed if when we come back for the second annual Mike Frogel event, okay, next year, if we say, look at all we've done in New York City, that will be a failure, right? But what have we done in upstate New York with our partners at Rochester and Buffalo? How have we built capacity in the US Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico, right? We worry about our technology dependent patients in Queens. We didn't have 2 months of loss of electricity last year, the way Puerto Rico did, right? So we really have to think about how we support them, okay? I'm not going to go back through the slides of the Peds Pandemic Network because I think we've harped on that. But the Pediatric Disaster Coalition, you've heard a lot about already from John and from George. Our missions are aligned with PPN and aligned with the missions of HRSA and aligned with the missions of everyone on this call. We will do better by sharing and collaborating, right? And Marie talked about this, like we should not be reinventing wheels. Use this symposium, use PPN, use the PDC, the NPDC to share resources. And, you know, Pat and I have had conversations. PPN is going to be great for sharing resources between children's hospitals and then using those children's hospitals, if I understand the mission correctly, to disseminate out to the community. But how do we get comparable and relevant information out to community stakeholders? Well, that's Pat and George and John and that group to disseminate out to those who really need to be the end recipients of some of this support. What can you do? And I'll just harp on this quickly because it's so important. Children's hospitals, do your PD pack, right? We just did this at Cohen's. It was an hour and a half. It was multidisciplinary. And we found a lot of deficiencies, right? And it's private, right? It's kind of like the PRP. Like no one's going to know your score, right? It's not even scored. Just giving you an idea of what you have to work on. Pick one thing and work on it. Engaging through the PDC, through the disaster collaborative is really, really important. Again, it's sharing best practices, open access education. And I will mention that one of our early deliverables, which we're really excited about, is we have $50,000 that we're going to pivot towards a colleague in Puerto Rico. That's going to be one of our main deliverables as the new FEMA Region 2 hub. I'll leave these up for a second, though anyone who doesn't have these websites probably isn't on this call, right? But I'll leave it up for a second for those who don't. Okay. And how do we make this, sustainable? It's everything we've talked about. It's, we are in a very dynamic time right now. All of our funding depends on the existence of our government support in the upcoming months. So we need to be advocates. We need to go to our senators and our congressmen and stomach it to say, we need help. And I know Joelle Simpson, who is, the PI for the for PPN, was just on the Hill last week. She mentioned that in the PPN call yesterday. So we have a voice, and our voice is louder together. Okay. I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I just wanted to sort of, before we open it up and let people get out a few minutes early, this has just been an amazing opportunity to present in front of people who I have an incredible amount of respect and esteem for. And while I only knew Mike in the later part of his life, I do think, I'll echo what John and George said, Mike is looking down, right? Looking down on us saying, this is the work he always wanted us to do. Right. And so if you didn't know Mike, what I'm telling you is there's that little voice that can be a challenging voice, those who knew Mike, that like, don't stop, don't give up. That's Mike Frogel talking to you guys. And I think we should all, I feel very honored to be amongst the 4 speakers here who can talk in his stead. He would have spoken for all 5 hours of this, I promise. And we should feel honored to be at the ability to do this. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to John, and with much appreciation for the work. And John, I don't think we've had a chance, like, you are the steamboat for all of this, right? Like, you are the person who's got the symposium together that keeps the PDC moving. Your expertise in management is something we all cherish. So thank you for your work on this, and I'll be quiet and turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Really appreciate that. Excellent talk. If anyone would like, please feel free to utilize the chat or raise your hand if you have a question for Matt. Otherwise, we're happy to release you 7 minutes early. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us, especially those who have been here with, 0 hour, which is now what, 4.5 hours almost, I believe. So your dedication is very much appreciated. And our intent, I know there's been a lot of questions about slides and recordings and all those things. This whole program has been recorded. Our intention is to publish that on YouTube, and then I will disseminate the link out to every single person who registered for the conference.
John, I think Pat's got her hand up. Go ahead, Pat.
Pat,
Yeah, Matt, fabulous presentation. I wanted to ask you about 2 things, okay? One, what does your comms look like, your communications, logistics look like with the field? And secondly, have you considered having to implement a secondary casualty collection point in front of the hospital? And how are you thinking about that? Because we know from various mass casualties, people self-transport, and you're not going to, I mean, EMS will be later. So I was wondering about your thoughts around that.
I'm going to answer in reverse, but maybe with one other caveat. So I would actually argue that for children's hospitals, the other wave, which we haven't thought about, is the transport wave that's going to come in multiple hours later, right? So there's people who show up by car, people show up by 911, and then the phone starts ringing of, I've got a kid with, right? And so one of the things we're trying to build, which we don't have a great process for, is what is our transport MCI process, right? I mean, we've got 254 ambulances at Northwell. We're a big shop, but they're moving all day. So what is the process by which so we have an abbreviated intake process, which we use during the New York City Mercy drill, but we've never tested in real life. So I think Children's Hospital should be wary that, you have that first wave of cars, then ambulances, and then for the next 12 hours, it's all the kids that either couldn't be operatively managed, had temporizing surgery. How many of those need to just go directly to the OR? So the transport brain here needs to shift into that.
Yeah,
don't
I just would want to say, don't forget to include your law enforcement in that. We have more and more reports of transporting patients, from the scene faster than EMS does.
Yeah, I mean, Philadelphia is a great example of that, right? For secondary casualty site, we haven't formalized that, but we actually, and I didn't put the picture up. We have 2 levels of triage. So there is an attending emergency medicine or fellow who is out front, who is a left-right, right? So if you are walking in and you look okay, you're not coming into the ER, you're going into the waiting room to the green area where there's a nurse, a tech, and a resident. If you are sick, then you go towards the ER. as you get wheeled into the ER, there's another attending there who goes critical or non-critical. So critical goes to our trauma bays or to our red side. Non-critical goes to our blue and green side. So it's sort of a secondary casualty point, but we're actually leveraging the fact that we have enough people. We're fortunate that at any part of the day, our lowest coverage is an in-house surgical fellow, in-house PICU fellow and attending, in-house hospitalist, and at least 2 pediatric emergency medicine. So even at 4 o'clock in the morning, we have enough people who can say primary triage, secondary triage, and care for kids. Comms to the outside EMS agencies, I don't know if you can, I mean, none, and it's horrible. And it's a function of we are in a big city with 1.5 million EMS calls a year, and it's no fault of our fire department or OEM. It doesn't exist yet. So on the county side, all of our disasters are handled locally. So if it happens in Port Washington, the fire chief's going to call. If it happens in Great Neck, they're not going to call. So I think another call to action for us to unify this process and figure out, now we do have things like NISA and Greater New York, and they will try to go places and give some awareness, but direct, let me tell you what's happening from the scene.
Wow. Yeah.
It's an opportunity, right? That's what all these things are, is they're opportunities.
I think there's a question in the chat.
Okay, so Leah, how can we reconcile the American Academy's recommendation to avoid involving children directly in disaster drills with the growing recognition? I just think they're wrong. Sorry, guys. I mean, I think that like well, that's too spurious. When we bring in, so first of all, like my kids aside, you're all mandatory reporters. You can do what you want with using my kids. But the high school students we use, what we do with all of them, number one, it's all voluntary. It's actually the pre-med club at like one of the local high schools. We get their consent, we get their parents, we get their assent, we get their parents' consent. They meet with the trauma team and the emergency medicine team by video before. We brief them in the morning. We debrief with them afterwards. They're part of our QR code process. We actually include them in our moments of silence before, sort of like the same way those of us who went to med school, before you cut the first time in cadaver lab, you say, let's take a moment to recognize the gravity of the moment that we have to train to take care of someone like you. So we really do try to mitigate that. So I would say that the AAP policy statement probably should just be reevaluated to say, how do you develop the appropriate pre-intervention? That way, when someone goes, you know what, now that I'm moulaged, I can't do this. No problem. They're all part of, they know the safety word, right? Popcorn, popcorn, popcorn. You're done. Hard stop. You want to walk out? We walk you out. They also all have a liaison whose sole purpose is that guy okay? How is he doing in this? We don't cut off their clothes unless they come in. You saw there one kid who wanted his shirt cut off, fine. So I think that the AAP perhaps should reevaluate that statement and say it has to be done the right way, perhaps, rather than saying it shouldn't be done. Clearly, you shouldn't be bringing a 4-year-old into an environment where it's smoke and loud gun. But I think for teenagers, adolescents who understand what you're doing, one last thing about this is that we tie this to stop the bleed. So actually, like before they even engage in any of this, we go do stop the bleed with them at the high school. So they're not even seeing the moulage stuff for the first time. So I hope I'm not losing my AAP membership in saying this. I just think we could do it in a more prescriptive manner. I'll let you know if I get kicked
One more question in the chat.
which
MCI transports occurring. Is there any data, information, and numbers on that?
Oh, that's a great question and a great opportunity, I think, for, I don't know if Mark is still on. In New York State, when someone arrives as an MCI patient, they get labeled a certain way in the hospital. I think that's so that the state can track patients who are from MCIs. I don't know, and maybe someone else who is engaged in EMS can say whether on the front end, patients are tracked. So I could probably report out how many MCI patients Cohen's has had in the past decade per event, including our drills. So yeah, I think you can track that on the hospital side. It'd be interesting to report out, though the majority of ours would thankfully be from drills. But that also assumes that the registrar understood it was an MCI and didn't just go, oh, it's 3 patients from the same car accident. So that would be a really interesting question that I'd be happy to, I'll put my email in. I don't know if all of our emails are going out.
Matt, I sit on the Pediatric Nemesis group, and right now the pediatric dashboard for the Nemesis is the National EMS Information System, and basically pulls all the data for all the hospitals and all the ambulance transports that and patients in an aggregated way. Right now, the metrics that they're following are the quality metrics. However, I've been banging on the group to basically include the demographics. And so, we get data like this, in terms of cumulative, and be able to drill down, based on state and county also. But your EMS agencies, I mean, where does your EMS agency send their state data? I mean, your EMS for Children's program coordinator should have access to some of that data as far as that's concerned. So that's a great place to start for your conversation.
Great. Well, it is 6:03, John, so I think it's time we let people go about their evenings or their late afternoons or their really late evenings, depending where they are. But John, do you want to send us out?
Yes, this was such a willing group. We still have over 100 people on overtime. It's amazing. I think if we continued this another hour, we would maintain that level. So special thanks to Angie Sorge, who was very responsible for the technology component of this webinar and all of our webinars. She's such a valuable asset to our team. So thank you so much for all you do and your dedication, and also setting up the registration online for us. Thank you very much to all the speakers. As I mentioned, we intend to publish this on YouTube, and my hope is that I'll email out the link to all of the registered participants. And of course, as I mentioned earlier in my eulogy, please remember Dr. Frogel today and always. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon, your evening, and be safe, and we'll be in contact. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime. My email is in the chat. Thank you again.